In the beginning, there was thunder, not the hollow rumble of earthbound storms, but the primal roar that splits reality itself, the sound of creation written in lightning across the cosmic void. Long before mortals gazed skyward in wonder and terror, before the first human lips whispered prayers to stormbringers, there existed a realm where thunder was not merely weather, but birthright. A golden city suspended between dimensions, where the very air crackled with divine potential and the architecture itself seemed forged from crystallized lightning. This was Asgard in the age of Odin's ascendancy, when the All-Father's conquest of the 9 realms had reached its glorious zenith. The rainbow bridge stretched across impossible distances, binding worlds in an empire of light and will. From his throne in Gladsheim, the one-eyed king surveyed domains that spanned from the fiery forges of Muspelheim to the frozen wastes of Jotunheim, from the luminous groves of Alfheim to the shadowed depths of Svartalfheim. Each realm bent knee to Asgardian might, their tribute flowing like rivers of gold toward the city eternal. Yet for all his temporal power, for all the victories carved in blood and lightning across 1,000 battlefields, Odin possessed the wisdom to understand that empires are not built on conquest alone. They are built on legacy. And so, as the cosmic wheels turned and the stars aligned in patterns that would not repeat for millennia, the All-Father turned his thoughts toward succession, toward the continuation of his divine bloodline. The circumstances of Thor's birth were woven into the very fabric of fate itself. Ancient prophecies, inscribed in runes of power upon tablets of Uru metal by the Norns themselves, spoke of a child born when 3 realms reached perfect alignment, a convergence that occurred but once in 10,000 years. On that night, as Asgard, Midgard, and Jotunheim formed a celestial trinity in the cosmic dance, the barriers between worlds grew thin as gossamer, and magic flowed like wine through the veins of creation. Frigga, queen of Asgard and mistress of all mystic arts, had prepared for this moment across centuries of careful study. She understood what Odin, in his warrior's pragmatism, sometimes overlooked: that power without wisdom is merely destruction, that strength without compassion is hollow tyranny. As the labor pains racked her immortal form, she wove enchantments of protection and guidance around her unborn son, whispering incantations in the old tongue that would shield him from the worst ravages of fate while still allowing him to fulfill his destined role. When Thor emerged into the world, the very foundations of Asgard trembled, lightning split the clear sky above the golden city, and thunder rolled across dimensions, announcing the birth of he who would one day shake the pillars of heaven. The newborn prince's first cry was answered by the roar of storm clouds gathering from across the 9 realms, as if all of creation recognized the arrival of its future guardian. The Norns, those ancient sisters who weave the threads of destiny itself, appeared unbidden in the royal chambers, their eyes white with prophetic sight. Born of storm and starlight, they intoned in unison, their voices harmonizing across octaves that mortal ears could not perceive. Hammerbearer and Realmshaker, the eternal enemy of chaos and the bridge between worlds. In his strength shall empires find their shield, and in his wisdom shall the cycle of Ragnarok find its balance. But prophecy, as Odin knew well, was both blessing and burden. The child would be mighty beyond measure, but that same might would attract enemies like moths to flame. He would be beloved, but that love would sometimes blind him to necessary truths. He would be a bridge between worlds, but bridges bear the weight of all who cross them, and sometimes that weight proves too great. The forging of Mjolnir had begun even before Thor's birth, in the great workshops of Nidavellir, where the dwarven smiths labored under contracts older than memory itself. The weapon was not merely a tool, but a cosmic instrument of divine will, its head shaped from Uru metal mined from the heart of a dying star, its handle carved from the wood of Yggdrasil itself. But the hammer's true power lay not in its physical construction, but in the enchantments that Odin would later weave upon it, spells that would make it both test and reward for the virtue of worthiness. As Thor grew from infant to child, the signs of his extraordinary nature became impossible to ignore. Where other Asgardian children might accidentally break toys with their developing strength, young Thor's tantrums summoned actual lightning bolts that scarred the palace walls. His laughter could clear storms that had raged for days, while his tears could call down rain across the Golden City. The palace staff learned to approach the prince's nursery with a mixture of reverence and healthy caution, for the child of Odin was not merely powerful, he was power itself given form and innocence. Yet, it was not only his connection to the storm that marked Thor as unique among the children of Asgard. From his earliest days, he displayed an almost supernatural empathy for those around him, a quality that seemed to flow directly from Frigga's protective enchantments. When servants injured themselves in his presence, he would cry as if their pain were his own. When visiting dignitaries brought tales of suffering from their distant realms, the young prince would listen with an intensity that unnerved even seasoned diplomats. This combination of immense power and deep compassion would prove both Thor's greatest strength and his most exploitable weakness in the trials that lay ahead. For now, however, it simply marked him as a child beloved by all who knew him, save perhaps for one. Loki's adoption into the royal family had occurred when Thor was still but a toddler, too young to remember a time when he had been an only child. To Thor, the dark-haired boy was simply his brother, his constant companion, his partner in countless adventures through the golden halls of the palace and the endless gardens that surrounded it. The young Thunder Prince could not yet perceive the shadows that danced behind Loki's green eyes, the nascent resentment that would one day grow into world-shaking hatred. In these early days, their bond was genuine and untroubled. Thor's boisterous strength complemented Loki's cunning cleverness, his honest directness balanced by his brother's strategic mind. Where Thor would charge headlong into play battles with wooden swords, Loki would orchestrate elaborate games of wit and misdirection. Where Thor's magic manifested in dramatic displays of elemental power, Loki's emerged as subtle illusions and shape-changing that delighted the court with their artistry. Yet even then, careful observers might have noticed the slight tightening around Odin's eyes when he watched his adopted son at play. The way Frigga's protective instincts seemed to sharpen whenever Loki was near her biological child. The All-Father knew what he had brought into his house when he claimed the abandoned frost giant infant from the ruins of Jotunheim, not merely a son, but a walking prophecy, a living reminder of ancient wars and future conflicts that might yet consume all the 9 realms. The palace itself seemed to respond to Thor's presence as he grew from toddler to child. Corridors that had remained unchanged for millennia began to show subtle alterations. Walls of golden stone developed veins that resembled lightning bolts, while the great windows started to attract more frequent visits from storm clouds that would gather just outside, as if drawn by some invisible force. The royal gardens bloomed with unprecedented vigor when Thor walked among them, and the ancient trees that lined the processional ways would rustle with phantom winds whenever he passed beneath their branches. These were the signs that marked Thor as no ordinary Asgardian prince, but as something more, a conduit between the natural world and the realm of the gods, a living embodiment of the primal forces that had shaped creation itself. The court scholars, studying these phenomena with the methodical precision that their kind brought to all mysteries, began to compile theories about the true nature of Thor's developing powers. Some believed him to be the reincarnation of ancient storm gods whose names had been lost to time. Others suggested that he was a unique fusion of Asgardian divinity and cosmic force, a being who existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions of reality. But perhaps the most accurate assessment came from an unlikely source, the ancient ravens, Hugin and Munin, who served as Odin's eyes and ears across the 9 realms. When asked by their master what they made of the growing prince, the wise birds spoke in unison. He is the storm given consciousness, the thunder made flesh. In him burns the fire of stars and the fury of tempests, but also the warmth of home hearths and the gentle rain that nourishes growing things. He will bring both creation and destruction, salvation and catastrophe. He is, in all ways, exactly what the worlds need him to be. As Thor's 7th birthday approached, that most significant of milestones in Asgardian tradition, preparations began for the ceremony that would mark his formal entry into the ranks of the divine nobility. It would be a celebration worthy of a future king, with representatives from all 9 realms in attendance to witness the Thunder Prince take his first official step toward his ultimate destiny. The Great Hall of Gladsheim was decorated with banners bearing the symbols of storm and lightning, while the royal kitchens prepared feasts that would satisfy both immortal palates and mortal dignitaries. Yet, even as Asgard prepared to celebrate its golden prince, shadows were gathering at the edges of perception. In the frost-locked wastes of Jotunheim, ancient frost giant kings spoke in whispers of revenge and the settling of old debts. In the dark spaces between worlds, entities of primordial chaos began to take notice of the growing power that blazed like a beacon from the Golden City. And in the deepest vaults of Asgard itself, seers and oracles began to experience disturbing visions, glimpses of a future where the thunder would fall silent and the golden halls would lie empty and cold. But for now, in these precious moments of innocence and joy, Thor remained simply what he appeared to be, a child of infinite potential, beloved by all who knew him, standing on the threshold of adventures that would echo through eternity itself. The god of thunder had drawn his first breath, and the cosmos itself held that breath, waiting to see what wonders and terrors would follow in the wake of his awakening power. The morning sun cast its golden radiance across the training grounds of Asgard, where destiny would be forged in sweat and steel, where princes learned to become gods of war. The vast courtyard stretched beneath the shadow of Gladsheim itself, its enchanted stones worn smooth by millennia of combat practice, each groove and depression a testament to the countless warriors who had honed their skills upon this hallowed ground. Here, beneath the watchful eyes of Odin's greatest champions, young Thor would begin his transformation from beloved prince to legendary hero. The ceremony of investiture had passed in a blaze of gold and glory, with Thor formally acknowledged as heir to the throne of Asgard, before the assembled representatives of all 9 realms. But ceremony was merely the beginning. The true test lay in proving worthy of the titles and responsibilities that came with divine birthright. As the first rays of dawn pierced the morning mist, Thor stood at the threshold of the training ground, his young face set with determination that would have been impressive in a warrior 10 times his age. His instructors were legends made flesh, each a master of their chosen discipline, each personally selected by Odin to shape his heir into the perfect fusion of warrior and king. At their head stood Baldur the Brave, Thor's uncle and the most beloved of all Asgardians, whose very presence seemed to radiate a light that made flowers bloom and birds sing. Baldur's mastery lay not in raw power, but in perfect technique, in the elegant precision that could turn any weapon into an extension of divine will. Beside him stood the warriors Fandral the Dashing, whose sword work was poetry made lethal, Hogun the Grim, master of tactical warfare and siegecraft, and Volstagg the Voluminous, whose jovial exterior concealed a strategic mind that had planned victories across a dozen realms. Each brought their unique perspective to Thor's education, understanding that the future king would need to master not just the art of personal combat, but the complex skills required to lead armies and protect nations. But perhaps the most challenging instructor was Lady Sif, whose raven hair and fierce demeanor marked her as one of Asgard's most formidable warriors. She alone among Thor's teachers showed him no deference for his royal blood, treating him with the same harsh discipline she would any recruit who presumed to train alongside Asgard's elite. Her lessons were the hardest, her criticism the most cutting, and yet it was from her that Thor learned some of his most valuable skills, not just in combat, but in humility. "A sword is not a club, young prince." Sif's voice cut through the morning air as she circled Thor's increasingly frustrated form. The training blade in his hands felt clumsy and unbalanced, a far cry from the perfect weight and response of Mjolnir that awaited him in his future. Power without precision is waste. Strength without skill is folly. Again. Thor's jaw tightened with the stubborn pride that would mark his character throughout his long life. But he raised the blade and attempted the complex sequence of attacks and parries that Sif had demonstrated. Lightning crackled involuntarily around his fingers as his frustration mounted, causing the training weapon to glow with barely contained electrical energy. "Control yourself." Baldur's gentle voice provided counterpoint to Sif's harsh instruction. "The storm serves you, nephew, not the other way around. Feel the lightning, guide it, but do not let it guide you." These early lessons in self-control would prove crucial in the years to come. Thor's power was raw and vast, a force of nature that responded to his emotions as much as his conscious will. Learning to master that power, To channel it with precision rather than simply unleashing it in magnificent displays required a discipline that did not come naturally to his passionate nature. Fandral took charge of teaching Thor the finer points of swordplay, transforming the prince's natural aggression into calculated technique. "Fighting is like dancing, my young friend," the swashbuckling warrior would say, his own blade weaving intricate patterns in the air. Every step must flow into the next. Every strike must set up its successor. Brute force may win battles, but elegance wins wars. Under Fandral's tutelage, Thor learned to appreciate the artistry of combat, the way a perfectly timed riposte could turn an enemy's strength against them, how footwork and positioning mattered as much as arm strength and speed. These lessons came easily to the young prince, whose natural athleticism and divine reflexes made him an apt pupil in the physical aspects of warfare. Hogun's lessons were of a different nature entirely. The grim warrior taught Thor to think like a general, to see beyond the immediate clash of arms to the larger strategic picture. They would spend hours hunched over detailed maps of the 9 realms, with Hogun pointing out the natural defensive positions, the supply routes that could make or break a campaign, the political considerations that could turn allies into enemies with a single, miscalculated move. "War is not about glory, young prince," Hogun would intone in his gravelly voice. "War is about objectives. Every battle must serve a purpose. Every victory must advance your ultimate goal. The warrior who fights for the joy of fighting will find himself surrounded by enemies and abandoned by friends." These strategic lessons were supplemented by practical exercises in the field, where Thor would lead small units of Asgardian guards in mock campaigns against the palace's defensive forces. Time and again, the young prince would learn the bitter lesson that individual prowess meant little if your troops were poorly positioned or your supply lines were cut. Victory required not just personal skill, but the ability to inspire and coordinate the efforts of others. Volstag's contributions to Thor's education were perhaps the most subtle, but no less important. The rotund warrior taught Thor the crucial arts of diplomacy and negotiation, showing him how words could achieve what swords could not. A king who rules only through fear is no king at all. Volstagg would explain over shared meals that were as much lessons as they were sustenance. True authority comes from respect, and respect must be earned through wisdom and justice, not just strength. Under Volstagg's guidance, Thor learned the delicate balance of statecraft, when to be firm and when to be flexible, when to make concessions, and when to stand immutable as stone. These lessons often took the form of elaborate role-playing exercises, where Thor would have to navigate complex diplomatic scenarios involving trade disputes, territorial claims, and ancient grievances between the various realms. But it was not just the famous warriors who contributed to Thor's education. The prince spent equal time learning from Asgard's scholars and historians, absorbing the accumulated wisdom of millennia. In the great libraries of the Golden City, he pored over ancient texts that chronicled the rise and fall of civilizations, the patterns of conquest and collapse that had shaped the 9 realms since the dawn of time. Master Runekeeper Alvis, despite his diminutive stature and bookish appearance, proved to be one of Thor's most demanding instructors. Under his guidance, the prince learned to read the ancient scripts that held the secrets of Asgardian magic and technology. The runes were not merely symbols, but living expressions of cosmic force, each one a crystallized fragment of the fundamental laws that governed reality itself. Power without knowledge is destruction waiting to happen. Alvis would lecture as Thor struggled with particularly complex runic equations. "Any fool can swing a hammer, young prince, but only a true warrior understands the principles that give the hammer its power." These lessons in mystical theory were essential preparation for the day when Thor would finally claim Mjolnir as his own. The legendary hammer was far more than a weapon. It was a cosmic artifact that required understanding as much as worthiness to wield properly. The enchantments woven into its Uru metal core responded not just to the user's moral character, but to their comprehension of the fundamental forces that the hammer channeled and controlled. Thor's magical education was supplemented by practical training with lesser enchanted weapons, each one designed to teach him different aspects of mystical combat. He learned to channel lightning through crystalline focusing rods, to call upon the winds with weather-working staves, to bind and banish hostile spirits with runic circles drawn in blessed silver. These skills would serve him well in the cosmic conflicts that lay ahead, where enemies would command forces far beyond the scope of mere physical combat. As the seasons turned and Thor progressed through his adolescence, his training expanded to include actual military campaigns. These were not the grand wars of conquest that had marked Odin's younger days, but smaller conflicts that nevertheless provided essential experience in real combat situations. The prince accompanied Asgardian forces on expeditions to quell uprisings among the more troublesome vassal states, to hunt down monsters that threatened peaceful settlements, and to enforce the Allfather's justice in regions where local authorities had proven inadequate. His first taste of real blood came during a campaign against the troll armies of Nornheim, where ancient grudges and territorial disputes had erupted into open warfare. The trolls, massive and brutish creatures whose strength rivaled that of the gods themselves, had been raiding Asgardian settlements along the border, carrying off livestock and terrorizing the local population. Thor rode into battle beside Sif and the warriors 3. His training sword finally replaced by a warhammer forged specifically for his use by the master smiths of Asgard. The weapon was magnificent in its own right, its head carved from meteoric iron and inscribed with runes of power, its handle wrapped in the hide of a storm dragon, but it was merely a shadow of the legendary Mjolnir that awaited him. The battle itself was a chaotic melee that tested every aspect of Thor's training. The trolls fought with bestial fury, their massive clubs and crude axes capable of crushing even Asgardian armor with a single blow. But they lacked discipline and tactical awareness, virtues that the prince had learned to value through countless hours of instruction under Hogun's stern guidance. Thor found himself in the thick of the fighting, his warhammer crackling with electrical energy as he carved a path through the enemy ranks. Lightning danced around him like a living thing, striking down trolls that tried to flank his position while his physical blows sent others flying through the air. For the first time, he truly understood the intoxicating rush of battle, the way time seemed to slow, and every movement became poetry written in violence. But the euphoria of combat was tempered by harder lessons. He watched good warriors fall to troll axes, saw friends and comrades cut down despite their skill and valor. He learned that victory always came at a price, that even righteous wars left scars that never fully healed. These experiences planted the first seeds of the wisdom that would eventually make him worthy of Mjolnir's power. The campaign in Nornheim lasted for several months, with Thor participating in dozens of smaller engagements that taught him the grinding realities of sustained military operations. He learned about logistics and supply lines, about the importance of maintaining morale among troops who were far from home and facing constant danger. He discovered that leadership meant making decisions where all options carried terrible costs, where victory required sacrifices that would haunt him long after the war was over. But he also learned about the bonds that formed between warriors who had bled together, the unshakable loyalty that came from shared hardship and mutual dependence. The warriors 3 became more than instructors during those months. They became brothers in arms, comrades whose friendship would endure through all the trials that lay ahead. When the troll forces were finally broken and scattered, Thor returned to Asgard, changed by his experiences. The eager young prince who had ridden out seeking glory had been replaced by a more thoughtful warrior who understood the true weight of command. Odin, watching his son's homecoming from the steppes of Gladsheim, nodded with quiet satisfaction. The boy was becoming the man who would one day be worthy of the throne. But the education was far from complete. As Thor's reputation spread throughout the 9 realms, so too did the attention of those who would test his growing power. In the depths of Jotunheim, frost giant kings began to plot their revenge for ancient defeats. In the dark corners of Muspelheim, fire demons whispered of the young prince whose lightning had begun to rival their own flames. And in the twisted spaces between worlds, entities of pure malice began to take notice of the storm that was gathering strength in the golden halls of Asgard. The prince's training continued, but now it carried an urgency that had been absent before. Odin himself began to take a more direct hand in his son's education, sharing secrets of kingship and cosmic responsibility that had been passed down through generations of Asgardian rulers. These lessons took place not in the training grounds or libraries, but in the sacred spaces beneath Gladsheim, where the very foundations of reality could be glimpsed and studied. "Power is a river, my son," Odin would tell him during these private sessions. "It flows from source to sea, and those who would master it must understand its currents and depths. Raw strength is the waterfall, impressive and destructive, but ultimately purposeless unless it serves to drive the mills and fill the irrigation channels that nourish growing things." These were the philosophical foundations that would one day support Thor's worthiness to wield Mjolnir. The hammer would not respond to mere power or noble birth, but to the deeper understanding that true strength came from service, that genuine authority flowed from the willingness to sacrifice personal glory for the greater good. As his training entered its final phases, Thor stood poised on the threshold of legend. His skills had been honed to a razor's edge, his character tempered in the forge of experience and hardship. The boy who had once summoned lightning through childish tantrums had become a warrior prince whose very presence on the battlefield could turn the tide of nations. But the greatest tests still lay ahead, and the shadows that had gathered at the edges of his young life were beginning to move toward the light. Soon, very soon, the Thunder God would face challenges that would dwarf anything he had yet encountered. Trials that would either forge him into the hero the Nine Realms needed, or break him entirely. The prince's education in war and honor was nearly complete, but as any student of destiny knows, graduation day often arrives wearing the mask of catastrophe. In the deepest vaults of Asgard, where ancient secrets lay buried beneath layers of gold and enchantment, there existed a truth that would one day shatter worlds. It was a truth known only to Odin himself, locked away behind barriers of silence and will, festering like a wound that could never quite heal. For among all the treasures and trophies of the All-Father's conquests, none was more dangerous than the small, blue-skinned infant he had claimed from the ruins of Jotunheim so many centuries ago. The child had been beautiful in the way that only the innocent can be, his ruby eyes wide with wonder, rather than the hatred that would one day consume him. When Odin found him abandoned in the rubble of Laufey's fallen palace, the infant's frost giant heritage had been obvious: his skin, the color of winter ice, his small form radiating the bone-deep cold that marked all of his race. But there had been something else there, too, a spark of intelligence and potential that the All-Father recognized as dangerous in its intensity. The transformation that followed was a marvel of Asgardian magic, an intricate weaving of illusion and reality that changed the child's very appearance. Blue skin became pale as moonlight, ruby eyes shifted to emerald green, and the aura of cold that surrounded him was replaced by a warmth that seemed almost human in its quality. To all observers, including the child himself, Loki appeared to be simply another Asgardian prince, born to nobility and destined for glory. But magic, however skillful, cannot change the fundamental nature of what lies beneath. As Loki grew from infant to child alongside his adopted brother, subtle signs of his true heritage began to manifest. He was always slightly colder to the touch than other children, his breath visible in winter air that barely affected his peers. His magic, when it began to develop, drew upon wells of power that had their source in realms of ice and shadow rather than the golden warmth of Asgard. More troubling still were the dreams that plagued him in the deep hours of night, visions of frost-locked caverns and ancient voices that called to him in languages he did not recognize. He would wake from these nocturnal journeys with ice crystals forming on his bedsheets, his breath clouding the air of his chambers, despite the eternal spring that graced the Golden City. Yet, for all these early signs of his alien nature, Loki's childhood alongside Thor was marked by genuine affection and shared adventure. The two princes were inseparable in those early years, their complementary personalities creating a bond that seemed unbreakable. Where Thor was direct and honest to a fault, Loki was subtle and cleverly strategic. Where Thor's strength lay in raw power and noble bearing, Loki's gifts manifested in cunning and the ability to see patterns that others missed entirely. Their games together were legendary throughout the palace, elaborate productions that combined Thor's love of grand gestures with Loki's talent for intricate planning. They would stage mock battles in the royal gardens, with Loki conjuring illusions of vast armies, while Thor provided the dramatic combat that brought their scenarios to life. The palace staff learned to expect minor miracles and occasional disasters whenever the two princes set their minds to entertainment. But even in these innocent diversions, careful observers might have noticed the subtle dynamics that would one day grow into tragic conflict. Thor's victories in their games always seemed to come through sheer force of will and physical prowess, while Loki's triumphs relied on misdirection and superior strategy. When the court praised Thor's achievements, they spoke of his strength and courage. When they acknowledged Loki's successes, they used words like clever and cunning, terms that carried subtle implications of deception and untrustworthiness. The first crack in their brotherhood appeared during Thor's formal weapons training, when the princes were perhaps 12 years old. In mortal terms, Loki had always been the more intellectually gifted of the two, mastering academic subjects with an ease that left his tutors amazed. But when it came to the physical arts of war, his smaller frame and different temperament put him at a distinct disadvantage. Thor excelled with blade and hammer, his natural strength and aggressive instincts making him a formidable opponent despite his youth. The Warriors Three praised his progress constantly, and even the demanding Sif admitted that the prince showed exceptional promise as a warrior. But when Loki attempted the same exercises, his efforts were met with polite encouragement that barely concealed disappointment. Perhaps the young prince would be better suited to the mystical arts, Balder suggested gently after watching Loki struggle with a training sequence that Thor had mastered weeks earlier. His gifts clearly lie in different directions than his brothers. The words were kindly meant, but they cut Loki deeper than any sword ever could. To be redirected away from the warrior's path was to be marked as lesser in a culture that valued martial prowess above all other virtues. It was a gentle but unmistakable declaration that he would never be Thor's equal in the eyes of those who mattered. Loki's magical education began in earnest shortly thereafter, under the tutelage of masters who recognized his extraordinary potential in the mystical arts. His mind was like a perfectly cut crystal, able to focus and refract magical energies with a precision that left even his teachers amazed. He mastered illusion and transmutation, with an ease that suggested these arts were as natural to him as breathing, while his studies in dimensional manipulation and reality alteration proceeded at a pace that would have been impressive in a student 10 times his age. But success in the magical disciplines only served to widen the gap between the two brothers. Thor's achievements were celebrated openly, with public ceremonies and formal recognition of his growing prowess. Loki's magical accomplishments were acknowledged more quietly, with whispered conversations among the court mages and private congratulations that carried the subtle implication that his gifts were somehow less worthy of general acclaim. The pattern repeated itself in every aspect of their education. When Thor showed mercy to defeated enemies during training exercises, he was praised for his noble heart and natural leadership. When Loki suggested strategic alternatives that would minimize casualties, he was noted as being pragmatic, or calculating words that carried undertones of coldness and emotional distance. The differences in how they were perceived by the court became even more pronounced as they entered their adolescent years. Thor's natural charisma and straightforward manner made him popular with everyone from the highest nobles to the humblest servants. His presence at court gatherings was always welcomed, his opinions sought on matters both trivial and significant. He was the Golden Prince, beloved by all who knew him, destined for greatness and glory. Loki's reception was more complex and troubling. His intelligence was acknowledged but also feared, his magical abilities respected but not entirely trusted. The court mages appreciated his insights into mystical theory, but they also watched him carefully, as if expecting him to cross lines that shouldn't be crossed. His wit and cleverness were entertaining in small doses, but there was always an underlying tension when he spoke, a sense that his words carried hidden meanings and dangerous implications. The first serious conflict between the brothers arose during a diplomatic mission to Alfheim, where both princes were to serve as part of an Asgardian delegation negotiating a trade agreement with the Light Elves. Thor was there primarily for ceremonial purposes, his presence lending weight and dignity to the proceedings. Loki had been included because his magical expertise was considered useful in understanding the complex enchantments that governed elven commerce. The negotiations had proceeded smoothly, until a dispute arose over territorial boundaries in the dimensional spaces where Alfheim touched the other realms. The Light Elves presented their case with the kind of intricate magical arguments that required deep understanding of multidimensional physics to fully comprehend. The Asgardian delegation found themselves out of their depth, unable to properly evaluate the elven claims or formulate appropriate counter-arguments. It was Loki who saved the day, his quick mind parsing the complex magical formulations and identifying the subtle flaws in the elven reasoning. His intervention not only protected Asgardian interests but actually improved the final agreement beyond what anyone had thought possible. The mission was hailed as a complete success, with praise flowing from Odin himself for the diplomatic coup that had been achieved. But when the delegation returned to Asgard, it was Thor who received the lion's share of the credit. The court focused on his dignified bearing and noble presence, treating Loki's crucial contributions as supporting details rather than the central factors that had made success possible. The pattern was so ingrained that few even noticed the injustice, accepting without question that Thor's role must have been the most important simply because he was Thor. Loki said nothing about the slight, maintaining his composure with the perfect courtesy that had been drilled into him since childhood. But those closest to him, particularly his mother, Frigga, noticed the way his jaw tightened slightly when the praise was lavished on his brother, the brief flash of something dark and bitter that passed behind his emerald eyes before being quickly suppressed. The incidents accumulated like drops of poison in a slowly filling cup. Each slight was small, each oversight minor, each example of differential treatment easily rationalized by those who participated in it. But together they formed a pattern that gradually eroded Loki's faith in the family and society that had raised him. His magical studies became increasingly solitary as he delved into arts and disciplines that his official teachers considered too dangerous or morally ambiguous for a prince of Asgard. He spent long hours in the deepest libraries, reading texts that whispered of power beyond conventional understanding, of secrets that could reshape reality itself, if one had the courage to grasp them. It was during one of these clandestine research sessions that Loki made the discovery that would change everything. Hidden in a manuscript that predated Odin's reign by millennia, he found references to himself not by name, but by descriptions so precise that there could be no doubt. The text spoke of a child of Jotunheim, stolen from his birthright and raised among enemies, destined to become the instrument of Asgard's destruction. The revelation hit him like a physical blow, shattering the fundamental assumptions on which his entire identity had been built. He was not Asgardian nobility, not Thor's true brother, not even truly Odin's son. He was a frost giant, a member of the race that Asgard had conquered and humiliated, raised as a living trophy of his adoptive father's victories. The truth explained everything: the cold dreams, the subtle differences in how magic flowed through him, the way he had always felt slightly out of place among the golden halls of Asgard. More painfully, it explained the court's treatment of him, the careful distance that even his supposed family maintained. They had known, all of them, and had chosen to maintain the lie rather than trust him with his own heritage. The confrontation with Odin came 3 days later, in the privacy of the All-Father's personal chambers where ancient tapestries depicted the conquest of Jotunheim in loving detail. Loki stood before the throne where his adoptive father held court, his face a mask of controlled fury that barely concealed the tempest raging within. "You took me." Loki's voice was steady, but each word carried the weight of accumulated betrayal. "You took me as a trophy, a living reminder of your victory over my people. How long did you plan to maintain the charade? Until I married some Asgardian noble and produced half-breed children who would never know their true heritage." Odin's response was measured, carrying the weight of centuries of difficult decisions. "I took you to forge peace between our peoples, to end the cycle of hatred that had consumed both realms for millennia. You were meant to be a bridge, a symbol of unity rather than conquest." A bridge. Loki's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "How noble. How very like you to dress your political calculations in the language of righteousness. Tell me, Father, was Thor part of this grand plan? Does he know what I am, or is he as much a dupe as I was?" The slight hesitation in Odin's reply was answer enough. Thor knew nothing of his brother's true nature. had been allowed to grow up believing their brotherhood was real, rather than a carefully constructed political fiction. The realization was somehow worse than the initial betrayal. Not only had Loki been lied to about his own identity, but Thor's affection for him was based entirely on false premises. The transformation in Loki's behavior was gradual, but unmistakable to those who knew him well. His legendary wit took on sharper edges. His clever pranks became more pointed and cruel. Where once he had used his illusions to entertain and delight, now they served to embarrass and humiliate those who had slighted him. The court began to speak of him in whispers, noting the cold gleam that had replaced the mischievous sparkle in his emerald eyes. Thor, still ignorant of the revelation that had shattered his brother's world, tried desperately to understand the change. His attempts at reconciliation were clumsy and well-meaning, but they only served to drive the wedge deeper. Every gesture of brotherly affection was now filtered through Loki's knowledge of their false relationship. Every moment of shared camaraderie tainted by the awareness that it was built on lies. The breaking point came during the celebration of Thor's 18th birthday, a magnificent festival that brought dignitaries from across the 9 realms to honor the heir apparent. The great hall of Gladsheim had been transformed into a wonderland of light and music, with entertainments that showcased the finest artistry that Asgard could offer. Thor stood at the center of it all, resplendent in ceremonial armor that caught and reflected the golden radiance of the hall's enchanted illumination. Loki watched from the shadows, his own finery seeming pale and understated beside his brother's magnificent display. As toast after toast was raised to Thor's health and future glory, as speaker after speaker praised the Golden Prince's virtues and accomplishments, the bitter poison of resentment reached its full potency in Loki's heart. The spell he wove was subtle, too subtle for any but the most skilled magical practitioners to detect. It was not meant to cause physical harm, merely to embarrass Thor before the assembled dignitaries, to show that the perfect prince was not quite as invulnerable as everyone believed. A simple illusion that would make Thor appear to stumble during his ceremonial sword demonstration, a minor humiliation to balance the scales of cosmic injustice. But magic, particularly magic fueled by rage and betrayal, rarely confines itself to its caster's intentions. The spell twisted as it took hold, amplified by Loki's suppressed fury until what should have been a harmless prank became something far more dangerous. Thor's sword, enchanted with protective runes, reacted violently to the hostile magic, sending bolts of lightning crackling through the hall and setting several tapestries ablaze. The chaos that followed was brief but devastating. Several guests were injured by flying debris, the hall's ancient decorations were damaged beyond repair, and the carefully orchestrated celebration dissolved into confusion and fear. But worst of all, from Loki's perspective, was Thor's reaction to the disaster. Instead of anger or embarrassment, Thor displayed only concern for those who had been hurt, moving through the wreckage to personally ensure that everyone received proper care. His first instinct was not to discover who had caused the mishap, but to take responsibility for the accident and make amends to those who had suffered. It was a display of character so genuine and selfless that it only served to highlight the growing darkness in Loki's own soul. The investigation that followed was conducted by Heimdall, whose all-seeing gaze eventually traced the magical emanations back to their source. When confronted with the evidence, Loki did not deny his role, but neither did he show remorse for his actions. He stood before the assembled court with his chin raised and his expression defiant, every inch the proud prince he had been raised to be. "I regret the injuries," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the shocked silence of the throne room. "But I will not apologize for revealing truths that others prefer to keep hidden. My brother is not the perfect hero you believe him to be, and perhaps it is time you all stopped pretending otherwise." The sentence was exile, not permanent banishment, but a period of isolation and reflection intended to help Loki regain his perspective and control his growing bitterness. He was to spend a year in the wild places of Asgard, in the ancient forests where the first gods had walked and where the primal forces of creation still held sway. Thor fought the decision, pleading with Odin to reconsider, offering to take responsibility for his brother's actions. But the All-Father remained unmoved, recognizing that Loki's problems ran deeper than simple sibling rivalry or adolescent rebellion. The boy needed time away from the pressures and expectations of court life, space to confront the demons that were consuming him from within. As Loki prepared for his exile, the final conversation between the brothers took place in the privacy of Thor's chambers, away from the watching eyes of the court. Thor's pain was evident in every word, his inability to understand what had gone wrong between them a source of genuine anguish. "What happened to us?" Thor asked, his voice thick with emotion. "We were brothers once, partners in everything. When did that change? When did I become your enemy?" Loki's response was carefully controlled, each word chosen to inflict maximum damage. "You were never my enemy, Thor. You were simply irrelevant. A golden puppet dancing to our father's tune, too blind to see the strings that controlled your every movement. I envied you once, but I've come to realize that pity is the more appropriate emotion." The words hit Thor like physical blows, but it was the emptiness behind them that truly wounded him. This was not the passionate anger of a hurt brother, but the cold calculation of someone who had moved beyond caring. The Loki who had been his closest friend and most trusted companion was gone, replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. As Loki departed for his exile, walking alone into the wild forests with nothing but the clothes on his back and the bitter knowledge of his true heritage, the golden age of their brotherhood came to its definitive end. Thor watched from the palace walls until his brother's figure disappeared among the ancient trees, unaware that he was witnessing the birth of his greatest enemy. In the months that followed, reports filtered back from the borderland sightings of a figure moving through the deep forests. Rumors of strange magics and unsettling encounters with the primal spirits that dwelt in Asgard's wildest places. But Loki himself remained hidden, wrestling with demons, both literal and metaphorical, in the solitude of his self-imposed exile. When he finally returned to civilization, the transformation was complete. The mischievous prince who had left in shame returned as something altogether more formidable. A master of magic whose power had been tempered in the forge of isolation, and whose heart had been hardened by the weight of terrible knowledge. He bore the title of God of Mischief now, but those wise enough to look beyond surface appearances understood that he had become something far more dangerous than a simple trickster. The stage was set for the great tragedy that would define both brothers' destinies. Thor remained the Golden Prince, beloved and trusted, but now carrying the burden of a brother's hatred like a wound that would never fully heal. And Loki had embraced his role as the shadow in the light, the necessary darkness that gave meaning to Asgard's brightness. Their next meeting would be as enemies rather than brothers, and the consequences would echo through the 9 realms for centuries to come. The fracture in their relationship had become a fault line that would eventually shatter worlds, and all because a lonely child had learned that love built on lies is no love at all. The great feast hall of Asgard had never witnessed such magnificence, nor would it again for many ages to come. Golden banners bearing the hammer of Thor hung from vaulted ceilings that seemed to stretch into infinity, while long tables groaned beneath the weight of delicacies gathered from across the 9 realms. Crystalline chalices filled with mead that sparkled like liquid starlight caught and reflected the warm radiance of 1,000 enchanted torches, creating patterns of light that danced across walls, adorned with tapestries depicting the greatest victories in Asgardian history. This was to be Thor's ascension ceremony, the moment when the crown prince would formally be acknowledged as heir apparent to the throne of Asgard. Representatives from every realm had gathered to witness the historic occasion. Light elves from Alfheim, whose very presence made the air shimmer with otherworldly beauty, dark elves from Svartalfheim, whose shadow cloaks seemed to drink in the surrounding light. Even a delegation of fire giants from Muspelheim, whose massive forms required specially reinforced seating. Thor stood at the center of it all, resplendent in ceremonial armor that had been crafted specifically for this occasion by the master smiths of Nidavellir. The breastplate was wrought from purest gold and inlaid with patterns of silver that depicted lightning bolts frozen in eternal motion, while the cape that hung from his broad shoulders had been woven from threads of light itself, creating a garment that seemed to glow with its own inner radiance. But perhaps the most significant element of his ceremonial attire was the crown that rested upon his golden hair, not the heavy circlet of kingship that Odin wore, but a lighter diadem that marked him as heir apparent. Its central stone was a fragment of crystallized thunder, captured from the first storm that had raged across the 9 realms at the moment of creation, and it pulsed with barely contained energy that seemed to respond to Thor's every heartbeat. Odin himself presided over the ceremony from his throne of black stone and precious metals, Gungnir resting across his knees while his ravens perched watchfully on the throne's high back. The All-Father's single eye surveyed the assembled multitude with the weight of millennia behind it, taking in every detail of this moment that would mark a turning point in the history of Asgard. "My son." Odin's voice carried clearly through the vast hall, enhanced by subtle enchantments that ensured every word would be heard by all present. "You have proven yourself worthy through deed and character, through strength of arm and nobility of spirit. The time has come for you to take your place as heir to the throne of Asgard, protector of the 9 realms, and guardian of all who look to our golden city for justice and protection." The formal words of succession followed, each phrase carefully crafted by generations of court scholars to carry the proper weight of legal and mystical significance. Thor responded with the traditional oaths, his voice strong and clear as he swore to uphold the laws of Asgard, to protect the innocent across all realms, and to serve the cause of justice even unto death itself. The ceremony reached its climax as Odin rose from his throne and approached his son, carrying an ornate casket that contained the symbols of Thor's new authority. Within its velvet-lined interior lay a scepter of office, a seal ring bearing the royal arms, and a scroll that detailed his new powers and responsibilities as heir apparent. But as the All-Father opened the casket to reveal its contents, a disturbance arose from the rear of the hall. The massive doors, each one carved from a single tree that had grown in the gardens of Asgard since the city's founding, burst open with a sound like thunder. Through the portal marched a column of figures that brought gasps of shock and dismay from the assembled guests. Frost giants. Dozens of them, their blue-skinned forms towering even over the tallest Asgardians, their ruby eyes blazing with hatred that had been nursed across centuries of defeat and humiliation. At their head strode Laufey, king of Jotunheim, his massive frame draped in armor of ice and shadow that seemed to draw warmth from the air around him. The temperature in the hall plummeted as the frost giants advanced, their very presence turning breath visible and causing frost to form on the golden chalices and ornate decorations. Several of the more delicate guests, particularly the light elves, began to withdraw toward the walls, their ethereal forms unable to tolerate the bone-deep cold that emanated from the intruders. Odin All-Father. Laufey's voice was like the grinding of glaciers, each word sharp with barely contained rage. "Your hospitality has grown poor in the long years since last we met. To invite representatives from 8 of the 9 realms while excluding the 9th, surely this was mere oversight rather than deliberate insult?" The assembled guests fell silent, understanding that they were witnessing more than a simple diplomatic breach. The tension between Asgard and Jotunheim stretched back to the very foundations of Odin's empire, built upon conquests that had reduced the proud frost giants to vassals and tributaries. Their appearance at Thor's ascension ceremony was an act of deliberate provocation, a challenge that could not be ignored without appearing weak. Odin's response was measured but firm, his hand tightening slightly on Gungnir as he addressed the unwelcome visitors. "King Laufey, your presence here violates the terms of the treaty that ended the last war between our peoples. You and your warriors will withdraw immediately, or face the consequences of breaking faith with Asgard." "Treaties," Laufey spat, his breath creating clouds of vapor in the suddenly frigid air. "Written by victors and imposed upon the defeated. Tell me, All-Father, does your precious heir understand the true price of his inheritance? Does he know that his crown is built upon the bones of my people?" However, Thor stepped forward, his young face flushed with anger at the insult to his father and his realm. The ceremonial armor he wore began to glow with contained lightning as his power responded to his emotions, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the great hall. "You dare come into our home, into the heart of Asgard itself, and speak of justice?" Thor's voice carried the rumble of distant thunder, each word charged with barely restrained fury. "Your people lost because they chose conquest over peace, because they sought to impose the tyranny of endless winter upon worlds that deserved the warmth of freedom. if there are bones beneath Asgard's foundations, they belong to those who died defending innocent lives from frost giant aggression. Laufey's ruby eyes fixed upon the young prince with an intensity that made the air itself seem to crystallize. Such fire in one so young, such righteous certainty. Tell me, Prince of Asgard, what do you know of war? What do you understand of the choices that kings must make when their people face extinction? I know enough, Thor replied, his hand moving instinctively toward the ceremonial sword at his side. I know that the strong have a duty to protect the weak, that those blessed with power must use it in service of justice. If your people face extinction, perhaps you should look to your own choices rather than blaming others for their consequences. The frost giant king's laughter was like the sound of icebergs calving into frozen seas. Such noble words from one who has never faced a true test. Very well, young prince. Perhaps it is time you learned what your inheritance truly costs. What happened next would be debated by historians for centuries to come. Some claim that Laufey made the first aggressive move, raising his hand to summon a blast of killing frost. Others insisted that Thor struck first, his legendary temper finally overcoming his ceremonial restraint. But all agreed on the consequence, a battle that transformed the sacred ceremony into a chaotic melee that would echo through the ages. Thor's lightning met Laufey's ice in a collision that shook the very foundations of Gladsheim. The ceremonial sword in the prince's hand blazed with electrical fire as he carved through the ranks of frost giant warriors, each strike accompanied by peals of thunder that shattered crystal goblets and sent guests fleeing for the exits. His movements were poetry written in violence, each blow precisely calculated to maximum effect, every defensive maneuver flowing seamlessly into renewed attack. But for all his skill and power, Thor found himself gradually overwhelmed by the sheer numbers arrayed against him. The frost giants fought with the desperate fury of the conquered, their ice weapons clashing against his lightning-wreathed blade in a symphony of cosmic forces. Around him, the great hall became a battlefield, as Asgardian guards joined the fray, their golden armor providing stark contrast to the blue-skinned invaders. The battle might have continued indefinitely, with casualties mounting on both sides, had Odin not finally intervened. The All-Father's voice rang out with the authority of absolute command, enhanced by magical compulsions that froze every combatant in place, regardless of their allegiance. Enough! The single word carried such power that frost and lightning alike dissipated into harmless sparkles of light. Warriors on both sides found themselves unable to move, their weapons held immobile by forces beyond their ability to resist. In the sudden silence that followed, only the sound of heavy breathing and the soft crackle of residual magical energy could be heard. Odin descended from his throne with deliberate slowness, Gungnir tapping against the golden floor with each measured step. His single eye surveyed the wreckage of what should have been his son's greatest triumph, shattered decorations, injured guests, and the unmistakable marks of battle scarring the ancient walls. "You have violated the sacred traditions of hospitality," he said to Laufey, his voice cold as the space between stars. "You have brought war into my house, blood into my halls. For this, there will be consequences. And you?" He continued, turning to Thor with an expression that made the young prince's blood run cold. "Have allowed anger to overcome wisdom, have chosen violence over diplomacy when other options remained. You have forgotten that a true king must sometimes swallow his pride for the greater good." The magical compulsion released the combatants, but none dared to resume fighting in the face of Odin's obvious displeasure. Laufey and his warriors withdrew with whatever dignity they could salvage, but not before the frost giant king delivered a parting message that would prove prophetic. "Your son has shown his true nature today, All-Father. When next our paths cross, remember that it was he who chose war over peace, he who valued pride above wisdom. The young eagle believes he can soar higher than the storm clouds, but storms have a way of humbling even the mightiest wings." As the frost giants departed, leaving trails of ice and bitter cold in their wake, Thor stood amid the ruins of his ascension ceremony with dawning realization of what had just occurred. The formal acknowledgement of his status as heir apparent lay forgotten on the floor, the ceremonial crown knocked from his head during the fighting, the symbols of his new authority scattered like leaves before a winter wind. Odin's judgment came swift and terrible. Before the assembled representatives of the 9 realms, many of whom had traveled vast distances to witness Thor's moment of triumph, the All-Father pronounced sentence on his own son. "You have shown yourself unworthy of the crown you sought to claim," Odin declared, his words carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You lack the wisdom necessary to rule, the restraint required to lead, the humility essential to kingship. Until you learn these virtues, you are banished from Asgard, stripped of your powers, and exiled to Midgard, where perhaps among mortals, you will discover what it truly means to be worthy." The enchantment that followed was a work of such complex magic that few present could fully comprehend its scope. Odin raised Gungnir high above his head, its tip blazing with power drawn from the very foundations of reality, and spoke words in the old tongue that had not been heard since the forging of the world tree itself. Thor's divine strength drained away like water from a broken vessel, leaving him feeling weak and hollow in ways he had never experienced. The lightning that had danced around his fingers since childhood flickered and died, while the storm clouds that had always answered his call dispersed into empty sky. Most devastating of all was the sensation of disconnection from Mjolnir. The legendary hammer that had been forged specifically for him suddenly felt as distant and unreachable as a star glimpsed through morning mist. The physical transformation was equally dramatic. His ceremonial armor dissolved into motes of golden light, replaced by simple mortal clothing that marked him as common rather than divine. His hair lost some of its lustrous sheen. His skin took on the pale quality of those who dwelt beneath ordinary suns rather than the golden radiance of Asgard. And his eyes, those piercing blue orbs that had blazed with divine authority, became merely human in their intensity. "Whosoever holds this hammer," Odin intoned as Mjolnir materialized in his hands, "if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor." The legendary weapon seemed to pulse with understanding, as new enchantments were woven into its already complex magical matrix, spells that would make it both test and reward for whoever might one day prove themselves deserving of its power. The banishment itself was accomplished through the Rainbow Bridge, but instead of the triumphant journey that Thor had always imagined making to visit distant realms, this passage was a chaotic tumble through swirling energies and dimensional barriers. He fell through space and time, his powerless form buffeted by cosmic forces that would have torn apart any normal mortal, protected only by the lingering traces of his divine heritage. He landed with bone-jarring impact in a desert landscape unlike anything he had ever experienced. Vast expanses of sand and stone baked beneath an alien sun, with mountains rising in the distance like broken teeth against a sky of impossible blue. This was New Mexico, though Thor had no way of knowing the name, a place as far removed from the golden splendor of Asgard as could be imagined. The first humans he encountered found him unconscious and raving, his mortal mind struggling to process the magnitude of what had happened to him. Dr. Jane Foster and her research team, investigating unusual atmospheric phenomena in the area, discovered the fallen god and brought him to their makeshift laboratory, where they attempted to understand both his condition and the strange readings their instruments had detected. Thor's initial interactions with these mortals were colored by arrogance and confusion in equal measure. He spoke of Asgard and the 9 realms as if they were common knowledge, demanded the immediate return of his stolen power, and seemed genuinely unable to comprehend that these humans could not simply restore him to his divine status with a wave of their hands. "I am Thor, son of Odin, rightful heir to the throne of Asgard," he would declare to anyone who would listen, his voice carrying traces of the commanding presence he had once possessed. "My father's anger will not last forever, and when I reclaim my birthright, I will remember those who aided me in my time of need." But as days passed without rescue or restoration, as his mortal body experienced hunger and fatigue for the first time in his existence, Thor began to understand the true scope of his punishment. This was not a temporary setback or a brief lesson in humility. This was exile in its most complete form, a severing of connections that had defined his very identity. The humans who had found him were kind in their own way, but they could offer him little beyond basic sustenance and shelter. Jane Foster, in particular, seemed fascinated by his claims about otherworldly origins, though she approached them with the skepticism of a trained scientist rather than the reverence he felt was his due. Let's say, hypothetically, that you really are some kind of Norse god, she said during one of their conversations, her tone carefully neutral. What exactly did you do to get yourself banished? Because in my experience, when someone ends up powerless and alone in the middle of nowhere, it's usually because they made some pretty serious mistakes. The question forced Thor to confront aspects of his situation that he had been avoiding. The battle with the frost giants, his failure to find a diplomatic solution, the way his anger had escalated a tense situation into open warfare when viewed through mortal eyes, his actions seemed less heroic and more foolishly destructive. I defended my realm, he said finally, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. My people were insulted, threatened. I could not stand by and allow such provocations to go unanswered. So you started a fight, Jane summarized with brutal clarity, in the middle of what sounds like a very important ceremony, with representatives from multiple realms, watching, and your father punished you for it. The stark simplicity of her assessment hit Thor harder than any physical blow. Stripped of the righteous justifications and noble rhetoric, his actions did indeed seem remarkably similar to those of a spoiled child throwing a tantrum when things didn't go his way. As his exile stretched from days into weeks, Thor began to experience emotions and insights that had been foreign to his divine existence. Humility came slowly and painfully, forced upon him by repeated reminders of his powerlessness. Empathy emerged as he witnessed the struggles of mortals who faced challenges far greater than his own, without the benefit of divine heritage or cosmic destiny. But perhaps most importantly, he began to understand the true meaning of worth, not as something inherited or granted by birthright, but as something earned through choices and actions that served others rather than the self. The lesson was harsh and often painful, but it was also necessary for the hero he would one day become. The fallen god's education in mortality had begun, and with it the long journey toward becoming worthy once again of the power he had lost. But that worthiness would not be easily won, and the challenges that lay ahead would test him in ways that no amount of divine power could have prepared him for. Somewhere in the desert of New Mexico, Mjolnir waited, its enchanted form drawing the curious and the ambitious like a magnet. But it would remain unmovable, a reminder of power lost and worthiness yet to be reclaimed, until its true wielder learned the difference between strength and true power, between commanding others and serving something greater than himself. The transformation was not instantaneous, nor was it merciful. In the swirling chaos of dimensional exile, as Thor's divine essence was stripped away layer by layer, like bark from a lightning-struck tree, something new began to emerge from the cosmic wreckage of his former self. The process was agonizing beyond mortal comprehension. Imagine having your very soul rewritten while fully conscious of every alteration, every diminishment, every fundamental change to the architecture of your being. When the dimensional storms finally subsided, and the last echoes of Odin's banishment spell faded into the cosmic background, what emerged was no longer quite the same entity that had fallen from Asgard's golden spires. Thor, Odin's son, remained, but buried beneath layers of enchantment and mystical compulsion that would reshape not merely his appearance, but the very foundations of his identity. In his place stood Dr. Donald Blake, a mortal physician whose memories stretched back through decades of human experience that felt as real and substantial as his divine heritage. The spell that created the Blake identity was perhaps Odin's greatest masterwork of magic, a complex weaving of illusion and reality that didn't simply disguise Thor's appearance, but actually created an entire alternate existence complete with history, relationships, and accumulated experiences. Blake remembered growing up in a modest home in the American Midwest, remembered struggling through medical school with determination born of genuine desire to heal others, remembered the countless patients whose lives had passed through his hands during years of dedicated practice. But beneath the carefully constructed mortal persona, fragments of divine awareness flickered like stars glimpsed through storm clouds. Blake would sometimes pause in the middle of examining a patient, his hand trembling slightly as half-remembered images of golden halls and cosmic battles danced at the edges of his consciousness. He would wake from dreams filled with thunder and lightning, his modest apartment still echoing with the phantom sound of his own voice, calling down storms from alien skies. The walking stick that became his constant companion was carved from wood that seemed ordinary to every examination, yet somehow felt familiar in ways that Blake couldn't quite articulate. Its weight was perfectly balanced in his grip, its surface worn smooth by what appeared to be decades of use, though he could not recall where he had acquired it. On particularly stressful days, when the pressures of his medical practice or the phantom memories that haunted his sleep became overwhelming, he would find himself gripping the stick with an intensity that left marks on its weathered surface. Blake's medical practice in New York was small but respected, focusing primarily on patients who couldn't afford the expensive specialists that dominated the city's medical establishment. His waiting room was perpetually filled with immigrants, elderly pensioners, and working-class families who had learned to trust the quiet doctor who never turned anyone away regardless of their ability to pay. His colleagues respected his diagnostic skills while privately wondering about the melancholy that seemed to shadow his otherwise competent and caring demeanor. What none of them could understand was the sense of incompleteness that plagued Blake's every waking moment, the feeling that he was somehow living a life that belonged to someone else, playing a role that fit him perfectly yet felt fundamentally wrong. He would stand at his office window during quiet moments, staring up at the sky with an expression of such profound longing that his receptionist often worried about his mental state. The breakthrough came on a vacation to Norway, where Blake had traveled in response to an inexplicable urge to visit the land of his supposed ancestors. He had told himself that the trip was merely an attempt to understand the recurring dreams that featured frost-locked mountains and aurora-painted skies, but some deeper part of his consciousness recognized it as a pilgrimage to sacred ground. The cave where he made his discovery was hidden in a remote mountain valley, accessible only through treacherous paths that would have challenged experienced climbers. Blake's decision to attempt the journey alone was so uncharacteristic that even he couldn't fully explain it. The mild-mannered physician who normally avoided unnecessary risks found himself scaling cliff faces and navigating glacier fields with an expertise that seemed to flow from muscle memory rather than conscious knowledge. The interior of the cave was a wonder of natural architecture, with crystalline formations that caught and reflected his flashlight beam in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. But it was the chamber at the cave's heart that stopped Blake in his tracks, forcing him to steady himself against the stone wall as recognition flooded through his altered consciousness. The walking stick in his hand began to vibrate with barely contained energy as he approached the chamber's center, where ancient runes had been carved into the living rock by hands that understood the fundamental forces of creation. The symbols seemed to pulse with their own inner light, responding to his presence in ways that defied every scientific principle he had spent his career studying. When he struck the stick against the stone floor of the chamber, not through conscious decision, but in response to some overwhelming compulsion that seemed to arise from the deepest levels of his being, the transformation was instantaneous and absolute. Lightning blazed through the confined space, not the harsh electrical discharge of earthbound storms, but the pure elemental fury that had been present at the moment of cosmic creation. The walking stick revealed its true nature, reshaping itself with fluid grace into the legendary Mjolnir, its Uru metal head gleaming with power that had been forged in the heart of dying stars. But more dramatic still was the change that overcame Blake himself. Mortal flesh gave way to divine muscle and bone. Ordinary clothing transformed into armor that seemed woven from the aurora itself, and the mild physician's demeanor was replaced by the bearing of a warrior prince who had walked among gods. The return of his memories was like a dam bursting, flooding his consciousness with centuries of experience and knowledge that the Blake persona had kept carefully suppressed. He remembered Asgard in all its golden glory, remembered battles fought across dimensions and diplomatic missions to realms beyond mortal imagination. He remembered Odin's disappointed gaze as the banishment sentence was pronounced, remembered the crushing sensation of divine power being stripped away like layers of skin. But perhaps most importantly, he remembered the lessons that his exile had been intended to teach. The years spent as Donald Blake, serving others without thought of personal glory or divine privilege, had shown him what true heroism looked like. It was not the magnificent gestures and cosmic battles that defined a hero, but the quiet dedication to helping those who could not help themselves, the willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for the greater good. The integration of Thor and Blake was not seamless. Two sets of memories, two complete identities, two fundamentally different approaches to existence had to be reconciled within a single consciousness. There were moments during those early days of renewed godhood when Thor would pause in the middle of a cosmic battle, overwhelmed by Blake's memories of treating sick children or comforting the dying. Conversely, the mild physician's instincts would sometimes assert themselves at the most inappropriate moments, causing the god of thunder to offer medical advice to defeated enemies or attempt diplomatic solutions to conflicts that demanded swift and decisive action. But gradually, through trial and error and the kind of patient practice that Blake's medical training had taught him to value, Thor learned to access the best qualities of both identities. From Blake, he retained the humility and empathy that made him genuinely care about the suffering of others. From his divine heritage, he drew the power and determination necessary to actually do something about that suffering on a scale that mortal physicians could never achieve. The double life that followed was complex beyond imagination, requiring Thor to maintain the Blake identity even as he began to establish himself as a hero on Midgard. During the day, he would see patients in his modest medical practice, using his enhanced senses and divine intuition to diagnose conditions that had baffled other physicians. At night and during emergencies, he would transform into the god of thunder, wielding Mjolnir against threats that ranged from common criminals to cosmic entities that threatened the very fabric of reality. The psychological toll of maintaining two complete identities was significant, but it was also educational in ways that Odin had probably intended from the beginning. Thor learned to compartmentalize his divine nature, to understand that true power came not from the ability to summon lightning or shatter mountains, but from the willingness to use that power in service of others, rather than personal aggrandizement. His relationships with other heroes during this period were complicated by the need to maintain his dual identity. When he fought alongside the emerging community of costumed adventurers that was beginning to coalesce around New York City, he had to be careful not to reveal too much about his true nature or the vast scope of knowledge that came with his divine heritage. At the same time, the Blake identity provided him with a unique perspective on human nature and mortal concerns that many of his superhuman colleagues lacked. The medical practice continued to thrive, though Blake's colleagues began to notice subtle changes in his approach to treatment. He seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to diagnose rare conditions. His prescriptions often included recommendations for rest and recovery that patients found remarkably effective, and his bedside manner had developed a quality of calm authority that put even the most anxious patients at ease. What they couldn't know was that Thor's divine nature was subtly influencing his medical practice, allowing him to perceive injuries and illnesses with a clarity that went far beyond normal human senses. He could detect the early stages of cancer months before conventional tests would reveal them, could sense the psychological trauma that often manifested as physical symptoms, and could sometimes accelerate healing through the careful application of the same forces that allowed him to control lightning and storms. The secret identity also served a crucial protective function for those around him. The enemies that Thor accumulated through his heroic activities, beings of cosmic power and infinite malice, were generally too proud or too focused on grand gestures to concern themselves with the pedestrian existence of Dr. Donald Blake. A mortal physician treating urban poor was beneath their notice in ways that the obvious allies and civilian friends of a known god would never be. But the greatest gift of the Blake identity was the ongoing education it provided in human nature and mortal courage. Through his patience, Thor witnessed daily examples of heroism that dwarfed anything he had accomplished in his divine form. Parents sacrificing their own well-being for their children's health, elderly patients facing terminal diagnoses with grace and determination, immigrants working multiple jobs to provide better lives for families they might never see again. These experiences fundamentally altered Thor's understanding of what it meant to be worthy of Mjolnir's power. The hammer had been forged to serve as the weapon of a protector, not a conqueror, and true protection required understanding what was actually worth protecting. The Blake identity gave him that understanding, in ways that no amount of divine instruction or royal education ever could have. The transformation back to his divine form was always a moment of mixed emotions, relief at reclaiming his full power and capabilities, but also a kind of loss as he left behind the simpler certainties of mortal existence. Blake's life might have been more limited in scope, but it was also more focused, and in many ways more meaningful. Every patient treated, every life saved or improved, was a victory that could be measured in tangible terms. As the years passed and Thor's understanding of both his identities deepened, he began to realize that Odin's banishment had been far more sophisticated than simple punishment. The All-Father had recognized that his son's greatest weakness was not arrogance or anger, but a fundamental lack of understanding about what he was fighting to protect. The Blake identity had provided that understanding in the most direct way possible by making him one of the people he was sworn to defend. The lessons learned during those years of dual existence would serve Thor well in the cosmic conflicts that lay ahead. When faced with threats that spanned dimensions and enemies whose power rivaled his own, he would always remember the quiet courage of mortal patience, facing their own impossible odds, the dignity of those who served others without thought of personal glory, the profound strength that could be found in accepting one's limitations while still striving to do better. Dr. Donald Blake had been born from divine punishment, but he became the foundation for the hero that Thor would eventually become, not the perfect prince of Asgard who had fallen from grace, but a being who understood that true worthiness came not from power or position, but from the willingness to use whatever gifts one possessed in service of something greater than oneself. The walking stick remained his most treasured possession, even when he carried Mjolnir openly, because it represented the bridge between his two natures and the hard-won wisdom that made him truly worthy of the god of thunder's mantle. In its simple wooden form, it was a reminder that the greatest power was often the gentlest, and that the most important victories were won not through cosmic battles, but through the patient, daily work of healing a broken world, one person at a time. The morning that would forever change the destiny of Earth, and indeed, the entire cosmos, began with what appeared to be a routine disturbance in the electromagnetic field surrounding Manhattan. Dr. Donald Blake, reviewing patient charts in his modest medical office, felt the familiar tingle of divine awareness that preceded moments of cosmic significance. Through the windows of his practice, he could see the aurora-like distortions that painted the sky in colors that had no names in any mortal language. But this was no natural phenomenon, no random fluctuation in the planet's magnetic field. This was the signature of Asgardian magic unleashed upon Midgard, power that carried with it the distinct resonance of his brother's distinctive mystical emanations. Loki had come to Earth, and his presence here could only mean trouble on a scale that would require the god of thunder's immediate intervention. The transformation from Blake to Thor took place in the privacy of his office, the wooden walking stick revealing its true nature as the legendary Mjolnir in a blaze of lightning that temporarily overwhelmed the building's electrical systems. But as Thor prepared to launch himself into the sky to confront whatever scheme his brother had devised, he found himself hesitating not from fear or uncertainty, but from a growing awareness that the disturbances emanating from Loki's location suggested a situation more complex than simple fraternal rivalry. The intelligence reports that reached him through channels both mortal and divine painted a picture that defied easy categorization. Loki had indeed arrived on Earth, but he had not come alone, and more disturbing still, he had not come as a conqueror in the traditional sense. Instead, he appeared to be manipulating events from behind the scenes, using his considerable powers of illusion and misdirection to set various heroic individuals against each other while remaining safely hidden from direct confrontation. The Hulk had been sighted rampaging through several major cities, his appearances following a pattern that suggested external manipulation rather than random rage-driven destruction. The being known as Iron Man, a name that Thor found both presumptuous and oddly endearing, had been investigating reports of advanced technology appearing in the hands of various criminal organizations. Ant-Man and his partner, the Wasp, had discovered evidence of supernatural influences affecting the behavior of insects across vast areas of the northeastern United States. But perhaps most significantly, the recently awakened super soldier called Captain America had begun tracking what he believed to be an international conspiracy of unprecedented scope, following leads that seemed to point toward a single mastermind, orchestrating chaos on multiple fronts simultaneously. Thor's divine senses, enhanced by his growing understanding of both mortal and cosmic detection methods, quickly identified the common thread, linking these apparently disparate incidents. Each represented a response to manipulations that bore Loki's distinctive magical signature, subtle enough to avoid detection by purely technological means, but obvious to anyone with the proper mystical training to recognize them. The confrontation that brought these heroes together was as dramatic as it was inevitable. Loki had engineered a scenario in which each of them would arrive at the same location, a decommissioned military facility in New Mexico, where strange energy readings had been detected, while believing that the others represented threats that needed to be neutralized for the greater good. Thor arrived to find the Hulk battling both Iron Man and Ant-Man, with the Wasp attempting to coordinate their attacks while Captain America tried to impose some kind of order on the chaotic situation. The sheer destructive potential represented by this assemblage of heroes turned adversaries was staggering, but what impressed Thor most was the restraint they were all showing even while engaging in combat. The Hulk, despite his obvious rage, was clearly attempting to minimize collateral damage to the surrounding area. Iron Man's repulsors were calibrated for incapacitation rather than lethal force, while Ant-Man's size-changing abilities were being used primarily for evasion and misdirection rather than direct assault. Captain America, even in the midst of what he believed to be a critical battle, was shouting warnings and tactical advice that demonstrated his concern for all combatants rather than simple victory. This was precisely the kind of behavior that Loki had not anticipated heroes who retained their heroic instincts even when manipulated into conflict with each other. It was a miscalculation that would prove costly for the god of mischief and providential for the future of Earth's defenses. Thor's intervention in the battle was swift and decisive, but also carefully calibrated to demonstrate his intentions rather than simply overwhelm his potential allies. Mjolnir's power was channeled not to cause massive destruction, but to create barriers of crackling energy that separated the combatants and forced them to pause long enough to actually communicate with each other. "Hold, warriors!" Thor's voice carried across the battlefield with the authority of divine command, but also with the tone of respectful address that he had learned during his years as Donald Blake. "You fight shadows and illusions rather than true enemies. The real threat lurks behind the veil of misdirection, pulling strings while noble hearts tear each other apart." The explanation that followed required all of Thor's diplomatic skills, drawing upon both his royal education in statecraft and his mortal experience in dealing with confused and frightened patients. He had to convince 5 powerful individuals, each with their own agenda and suspicions that they had been manipulated into conflict by an enemy whose very existence most of them had never imagined. Captain America, with his soldier's instinct for recognizing deception and misdirection, was the first to grasp the implications of Thor's revelations. "You're saying that someone has been playing us against each other, using our own heroic instincts to create exactly the kind of chaos they wanted?" "My brother has ever been gifted in the arts of manipulation and illusion," Thor replied, his tone carrying the weight of centuries of bitter experience. "Loki sees the noble qualities in others not as virtues to be admired, but as weaknesses to be exploited. Your dedication to protecting innocent lives becomes a tool he can use to position you exactly where he needs you to be." Iron Man's technological analysis confirmed Thor's mystical detection methods. His armor's sensors finally calibrated to recognize the subtle energy signatures that had been influencing events. "The interference patterns I've been tracking all lead back to a single source, and it's been moving around the globe in a pattern that matches the timing of every coincidental crisis we've each been responding to." The Hulk's transformation back to Dr. Bruce Banner was gradual but complete, the brilliant scientist's analytical mind already beginning to piece together the implications of their situation. If we've all been manipulated into this confrontation, then the question becomes, what was the manipulation designed to achieve? What does this Loki character gain from getting us to fight each other? The answer, when it came, was both simple and terrifying in its implications. Loki had not been trying to eliminate Earth's emerging community of heroes, he had been testing them. evaluating their capabilities and psychological profiles in preparation for a much larger scheme that would require their unwitting cooperation. The god of mischief revealed himself at last, his illusions dropping away like discarded masks to show him standing atop a nearby mesa, his arms spread wide in a gesture of theatrical triumph. But there was something different about him from the brother Thor remembered, something harder and more desperate that spoke of plans within plans and schemes that extended far beyond simple sibling rivalry. How delightfully predictable, Loki called down to the assembled heroes, his voice carrying clearly across the desert air despite the distance. The noble Thor, rushing to save mortals from their own noble impulses. Tell me, brother, have you learned to appreciate the irony? These people, you're so eager to protect, they're the very weapon I intend to use against you. The revelation that followed transformed their understanding of the entire situation. Loki had not come to Earth as a conqueror, but as a refugee fleeing from cosmic forces that had been awakened by his manipulations in other realms, entities of such power and malice that even his considerable abilities were insufficient to contain or control them. The Chitauri hunger, dear brother, Loki continued, his theatrical manner not quite masking the genuine fear that underlaid his words. Ancient devourers of worlds, sleeping between the stars until awakened by the scent of growing power. Did you think your little displays of divine might would go unnoticed? Did you imagine that Earth's emerging community of heroes would remain secret from those who watch the dark spaces between worlds? The implications were staggering. Loki's manipulations had not been an invasion in their own right, but preparation for the real invasion that was coming, a cosmic-level threat that would require every available defender working in perfect coordination if Earth was to have any hope of survival. Thor felt the familiar weight of cosmic responsibility settling upon his shoulders. But this time it was tempered by a new understanding of what that responsibility actually meant. He was no longer the arrogant prince who believed his own power sufficient to solve any problem, but a being who had learned to recognize the strength that came from working alongside others who shared his commitment to protecting innocent lives. Then we must prepare, he said simply, his words addressed as much to his new allies as to his brother. If the darkness comes seeking Earth, it will find not scattered heroes fighting alone, but united champions standing as one against the tide. The formation of the Avengers was not accomplished through formal ceremonies or elaborate legal documents, but through the simple recognition of shared purpose among individuals who had proven themselves willing to sacrifice personal interests for the greater good. Each brought unique capabilities to the alliance. Thor's cosmic awareness and divine power, Captain America's tactical genius and unshakable moral compass, Iron Man's technological innovation and strategic thinking, the Hulk's nearly unlimited strength and Banner's scientific brilliance, Ant-Man's expertise in quantum mechanics and size manipulation, and the Wasp's espionage skills and ability to coordinate complex operations. But perhaps more importantly, each brought the wisdom that came from having faced their own failures and limitations. Thor had learned humility through exile, and the patience required to serve others rather than command them. Captain America carried the knowledge of what could be lost when good people failed to stand together against evil. Iron Man understood the responsibility that came with power and the importance of using technology to serve humanitarian goals rather than personal advancement. The Hulk represented the necessity of controlling destructive impulses for the sake of those who could not protect themselves, while Banner embodied the dedication to knowledge and understanding that made such control possible. Ant-Man and the Wasp demonstrated that heroism was not about the scale of one's powers, but about the willingness to risk everything for others regardless of the odds. Their first mission as a team was to deal with Loki himself, not as enemies seeking vengeance, but as protectors determined to prevent his schemes from causing further harm, while also addressing the larger threat that had driven him to such desperate measures. The battle that followed was unlike anything Earth had ever witnessed, combining mystical forces and advanced technology in patterns that rewrote the laws of physics and challenged the fundamental assumptions about what was possible. Thor's role in the conflict was crucial, but not dominant. He served as the team's connection to cosmic forces and mystical knowledge, while also providing raw power when needed, but he had learned to integrate his abilities with those of his teammates, rather than simply overwhelming problems through divine might. When Captain America called for coordinated attacks, Thor responded with precise applications of lightning that complemented Iron Man's repulsors and the Hulk's raw strength. When Banner needed time to analyze mystical phenomena that were beyond his scientific training, Thor provided both protection and the cultural context necessary to understand Asgardian magical principles. The resolution of their conflict with Loki was complex and morally ambiguous in ways that would have frustrated Thor's younger self, but which he now understood as necessary elements of true justice. Loki was defeated and contained, but not through simple violence. Instead, the Avengers found ways to address the underlying fears and desperation that had driven his actions, while also ensuring that he could not continue to threaten innocent lives. More importantly, they began the process of preparing Earth for the larger threats that Loki's manipulations had drawn to their world. This preparation went far beyond military readiness or technological advancement. It required the creation of institutions and alliances that could coordinate global responses to cosmic-level crises, while also maintaining democratic values and individual freedoms that made Earth worth defending. Thor's contribution to these efforts drew upon both his divine heritage and his mortal experiences. As a prince of Asgard, he understood the political complexities of maintaining alliances between very different cultures and power structures. As Donald Blake, he had learned the importance of building trust through consistent, reliable service to others, rather than grand gestures or displays of authority. The Avengers that emerged from these early trials were more than a simple team of superheroes. They were the prototype for a new kind of organization that could respond to threats ranging from street-level crime to cosmic invasions, while maintaining accountability to the people they protected. Their success would inspire similar groups around the world and across the cosmos, creating networks of cooperation that would prove essential in the battles yet to come. But perhaps the most significant outcome of Thor's integration into this team of mortal heroes was the continued evolution of his own character and understanding. Working alongside beings who possessed no divine heritage or cosmic destiny, who had chosen to risk everything for others despite being just as vulnerable to harm as those they protected, deepened his appreciation for the true nature of heroism. Captain America's unwavering moral courage in the face of impossible odds, Iron Man's willingness to risk his life using technology that could fail at any moment, the Hulk's constant struggle to control forces that could easily destroy everything he cared about. These examples of mortal heroism provided Thor with models of virtue that no amount of Asgardian training could have offered. The god of thunder had found his place among the champions of Earth, but more importantly, he had found the final pieces of wisdom necessary to become truly worthy of Mjolnir's power. The hammer responded to his commands now, not just because of his divine heritage or royal bloodline, but because he had learned to wield power in service of others rather than in pursuit of personal glory. The Avengers had assembled, and Earth would never be the same. But neither would Thor, for he had discovered that the greatest strength came not from standing above others as their divine protector, but from standing alongside them as their brother in arms, united by shared purpose and mutual respect in the endless fight against darkness. In the vast tapestry of cosmic conflict that surrounds the Nine Realms, certain threads burn brighter than others, patterns of enmity and alliance that stretch across millennia, weaving stories of such epic scope that mortal minds can barely comprehend their true magnitude. Thor's emergence as both Divine Prince and Earth's champion had marked him as a figure of cosmic significance, a beacon that drew the attention of entities whose very existence represented fundamental forces in the eternal struggle between order and chaos. The first to answer this dark summons was Amora the Enchantress, whose beauty was exceeded only by her capacity for magical manipulation, and whose obsession with Thor bordered on cosmic significance in its intensity. She had been present at the royal court during his youth, one of many ambitious nobles who had recognized early the potential power that could be gained through alliance with the future king. But where others had settled for subtle political maneuvering, Amora had chosen a path that combined magical mastery with emotional manipulation on a scale that challenged the very foundations of Asgardian society. Her powers were rooted in the deepest mysteries of feminine mysticism, drawing upon forces that predated even Odin's rise to power. She could weave illusions so perfect that they became temporarily real, could command the loyalty of mortals and gods alike through enchantments that targeted the fundamental drives of consciousness itself. But her greatest weapon was her understanding of desire, not mere physical attraction, but the deeper hungers that drove intelligent beings to seek meaning, purpose, and connection with others. Thor's resistance to her enchantments had begun as simple royal courtesy. He was betrothed by political necessity to others, and his education in statecraft had taught him to recognize and resist the more obvious forms of magical manipulation. But as his character developed through exile and redemption, his immunity to her powers became something far more threatening to her worldview. He represented the possibility that beings could find fulfillment through service to others rather than through the accumulation of personal power, and this possibility struck at the very core of her magical philosophy. Her campaign against him was therefore more than simple romantic obsession. It was an attempt to prove that virtue was merely ignorance, that nobility was just naivete, waiting to be corrected through proper education in the realities of power. She enlisted the aid of the executioner, a warrior whose loyalty to her was absolute, but whose own code of honor created fascinating contradictions in their partnership. Scourge the Executioner was perhaps the finest warrior ever to emerge from the wild borderlands of Asgard, a being whose skill with his enchanted axe was matched only by his tragic inability to understand that prowess in battle was meaningless without wisdom to guide it. His devotion to Amora was genuine but doomed, for she valued him only as a tool to be used in her larger schemes. Yet there was something pure in his loyalty that Thor could not help but respect, even as he was forced to battle against it repeatedly. Their conflicts took place across multiple dimensions and timelines, with Amora using her mastery of temporal magic to attack Thor through his past and future selves. She would manifest in his memories, attempting to convince his younger self that his exile had been unjust, that his father's harsh lessons were merely cruel manipulation, designed to break his spirit. She attacked his future, showing him visions of Asgard fallen and his friends betrayed, all because he had chosen to waste his time protecting insignificant mortals rather than claiming his rightful place as a cosmic ruler. But perhaps her most insidious attack was her attempt to corrupt his relationship with Jane Foster, the mortal woman whose love had helped him understand the true meaning of worthiness. Amora appeared to Jane in dreams and visions, showing her the cosmic scope of Thor's true responsibilities, the wives and children he could have across a dozen realms, the political alliances that his romantic attachment to a mortal woman was preventing. "You think you love him," Amora whispered in Jane's sleeping mind, her voice carrying the weight of cosmic authority. "But love requires understanding. And how can you understand a being whose existence spans dimensions you cannot even imagine? You are holding him back from his true destiny, forcing him to diminish himself to match your limited scope of existence." The psychological warfare was sophisticated beyond anything Thor had encountered, requiring him to develop new forms of mental and spiritual defense, while also protecting those he cared about from manipulation they were not equipped to recognize or resist. He learned to shield his thoughts from mystical intrusion, to recognize the subtle signs of reality alteration that marked Amora's presence, and most importantly, to maintain his faith in the values and relationships that gave his life meaning, even when surrounded by illusions designed to make them seem worthless. The final confrontation with the Enchantress and Executioner took place in the ruins of an ancient temple that existed simultaneously in Asgard and on Earth, a dimensional nexus that amplified magical forces beyond their normal limitations. The battle that followed was as much philosophical as physical, with words serving as weapons that could reshape reality itself. "You could have anything," Amora declared, as mystical energies swirled around them in patterns that defied conventional physics. "Power beyond imagination, pleasure without limit, knowledge that would make you rival the cosmic entities themselves. Why do you choose this narrow path of service and sacrifice when infinity itself beckons?" Thor's response was delivered not through grand speeches, but through actions, his protection of the Executioner when Amora's manipulations put him in mortal danger, his healing of civilians caught in the crossfire of their battle, his refusal to use his full power against enemies whose opposition was born of pain rather than malice. Because infinity without purpose is merely elaborate emptiness," he replied, channeling lightning not to destroy, but to illuminate the hidden truths that Amora's illusions had obscured. Power that serves only itself becomes its own prison, cutting those who wield it off from everything that makes existence meaningful. The defeat of the enchantress was accomplished not through superior force, but through the patient demonstration of alternative possibilities, showing Skirg that loyalty could be earned through respect rather than magical compulsion, revealing to Amora herself the hollow nature of the cosmic solitude she was creating for herself through her manipulations. But even as these mystical threats were contained, new enemies emerged from the darker corners of existence. Ulik the Troll represented a different kind of challenge entirely, not the subtle manipulation of the enchantress, but the straightforward application of overwhelming physical force, guided by an intelligence that most observers underestimated due to his brutal appearance. The rock trolls of Nornheim had been among Asgard's most persistent enemies for millennia, their primitive culture and crude technology leading many to dismiss them as mere nuisances rather than genuine threats. But Ulik had evolved beyond the limitations of his species, combining their natural strength and durability with strategic thinking that had been honed through centuries of defeats and reversals. His challenge to Thor was intensely personal, not born of cosmic philosophy or romantic obsession, but from the simple recognition that the god of thunder represented everything that the troll armies had been unable to achieve through traditional conquest. Ulik saw in Thor's power and position the summit of warrior achievement, and his desire to claim that summit through single combat was both admirable in its purity and terrifying in its implications. Their battles were epic in scope, ranging across realms and dimensions as Ulik pursued his obsession with proving himself superior to Asgard's champions. The troll's enchanted knuckle dusters could shatter mountains and deflect lightning, while his tactical innovations kept surprising Thor with their effectiveness, despite their apparent simplicity. But perhaps more challenging than Ulik's physical prowess was his ability to expose the contradictions in Thor's own approach to conflict resolution. The god of thunder's preference for redemption over destruction, his belief that even the most hardened enemies could be reached through patient demonstration of alternative paths, was put to severe test by an opponent whose entire identity was built around the pursuit of glorious battle. "You hold back," Ulik observed during one of their confrontations, his massive fists crashing against Mjolnir's defenses with enough force to crack the dimensional barriers between realms. "You fight to subdue rather than to win, to convert rather than to conquer. But I am not some misguided fool who can be shown the error of his ways through gentle correction. I am what I am, a warrior who lives for the joy of battle, who finds meaning only in the testing of strength against strength." The philosophical challenge was profound. How could Thor maintain his commitment to redemption and mercy when faced with an enemy whose fundamental nature seemed to require conflict for its very existence? The answer, when it came, required a deeper understanding of what Ulik actually represented, not mere brutality, but the pure expression of the warrior ideal, stripped of all political or social complications. Thor's eventual victory came not through overwhelming force, but through the recognition that Ulik's obsession with honorable combat could be channeled toward constructive rather than destructive ends. The establishment of formal dueling grounds, where the troll could test himself against worthy opponents without endangering innocent lives, represented a compromise that satisfied his warrior's nature while protecting the realms from his destructive potential. Yet even as these earthbound and dimensional threats were being addressed, darker forces stirred in the cosmic depths where ancient evils waited for opportunities to reclaim dominions they had lost eons ago. The absorbing man emerged from these shadows not as a creature of magic or alien origin, but as a testament to mortal science's capacity to create threats that rivaled divine power through sheer audacity and innovative thinking. Karl Crusher Creel had been a simple criminal before his transformation, a boxer whose career had been destroyed by his inability to control his violent impulses outside the ring. But his encounter with Asgardian artifacts during a museum heist had triggered changes that even Odin's most learned scholars struggled to understand fully. The mystical energies contained within a fragment of the absorbing man's prison had bonded with his cellular structure in ways that defied both magical theory and scientific explanation. His power was elegantly simple and terrifyingly versatile, He could absorb the properties of any material he touched, temporarily transforming his body into living versions of substances ranging from simple steel to exotic cosmic alloys. When he absorbed the properties of Thor's hammer during their first encounter, he briefly became a being whose strength and durability rivaled that of the gods themselves, wielding Mjolnir's cosmic forces with the crude effectiveness of a mortal who had no understanding of their true scope. But the absorbing man represented more than just another physically powerful opponent. He embodied the potential for scientific advancement to create threats that cosmic entities had never anticipated. His abilities had been born from the intersection of Asgardian magic and earthly determination, proving that mortals need not remain helpless before divine power if they possessed sufficient ingenuity and willingness to take risks. Their conflicts forced Thor to develop new tactical approaches that combined his mystical knowledge with scientific principles learned during his time as Donald Blake. He discovered that the absorbing man's powers, while formidable, operated according to rules that could be understood and exploited by opponents who possessed sufficient patience and analytical skill. "You think like a god," Creel taunted during one of their battles, his body shifting between different absorbed materials with each exchange of blows. "All cosmic forces and mystical principles, but I'm pure human ingenuity. I adapt, I evolve, I find ways around problems that your divine education never prepared you for." The observation was accurate enough to be troubling. Thor's approach to problem-solving had indeed been shaped by millennia of Asgardian training that emphasized the application of overwhelming power guided by ancient wisdom. The absorbing man's crude but effective methods served as a reminder that innovation often came from unexpected sources, that the combination of desperate necessity and creative thinking could produce solutions that traditional approaches could never achieve. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these conflicts was the way they forced Thor to confront the limitations of his redemptive philosophy. Creel was not driven by cosmic ambitions or mystical obsessions that could be redirected toward constructive purposes. He was motivated by simple greed and the desire for revenge against a society that had failed to provide him with legitimate outlets for his aggressive nature. The resolution of their conflicts required Thor to develop a more nuanced understanding of justice, one that combined his commitment to mercy with realistic acknowledgement of the constraints imposed by mortal psychology and social structures. Rather than simply defeating Creel and expecting him to reform, Thor worked with Earth's legal and scientific authorities to develop containment methods that could neutralize his threat, while also addressing the underlying social conditions that had created him. While these earthly challenges tested Thor's growing wisdom, cosmic forces of incomparably greater scope were beginning to take notice of the unusual events surrounding Midgard and its divine protector. Surtur, the fire demon, represented perhaps the most ancient and implacable of these threats, a being whose existence predated Odin's rise to power and whose grudge against Asgard was woven into the very foundations of Norse mythology. The Lord of Muspelheim was not merely a powerful enemy, but a cosmic principle given form, the embodiment of entropy and destruction that would ultimately consume all things when Ragnarok finally arrived. His presence in any realm was like a wound in reality itself, a breach through which the fundamental forces of ending could pour into dimensions that were not yet ready for their final dissolution. Surtur's interest in Thor was both personal and apocalyptic in its implications. The fire demon recognized in the god of thunder a potential catalyst for the events that would lead to Ragnarok, not as an agent of destruction, but as the heroic figure whose very attempts to prevent cosmic catastrophe might trigger the exact conditions necessary for its fulfillment. "You cannot escape your destiny, son of Odin." Surtur's voice was like the sound of stars being consumed by cosmic fire, each word carrying enough heat to melt ordinary matter into its component atoms. The more you struggle against the prophecies, the more certainly you fulfill them. Your very heroism is the mechanism by which the cycle of ending shall be completed. The battles against Surtur took place on scales that dwarfed anything Thor had previously experienced, ranging across dimensions where the normal laws of physics held no meaning and time flowed according to principles that mortal minds could not comprehend. These were not simple contests of strength or skill, but fundamental conflicts between opposing cosmic forces that determined the fate of entire reality systems. Thor found himself fighting not just against an immensely powerful enemy, but against the weight of destiny itself, the terrible possibility that his every action might be unknowingly advancing the very catastrophe he was trying to prevent. The psychological pressure of this realization was almost overwhelming, forcing him to question whether heroic action was meaningful when it might be serving the purposes of cosmic forces beyond his understanding. The answer, when it came, required a level of philosophical sophistication that combined Asgardian wisdom with insights gained through his experiences among mortals. Thor realized that the prophecies of Ragnarok were not fixed commands that had to be obeyed, but rather descriptions of potential outcomes that could be influenced through conscious choice and moral action. "If I am to be an instrument of ending," he declared during his final confrontation with Surtur, lightning dancing around him in patterns that seemed to defy the fire demon's entropic influence, "then I choose to be an instrument of ending that serves renewal rather than mere destruction. Let the old cycle conclude, but let it conclude in such a way that what follows will be worthy of the sacrifice required to create it." This philosophical victory proved more significant than any physical triumph could have been. By accepting his role in cosmic events while simultaneously asserting his moral agency within that role, Thor had found a way to participate in destiny without being enslaved by it. But even as these cosmic-level threats were being addressed, more immediate dangers continued to emerge from unexpected quarters. The Wrecker and his wrecking crew represented a particularly troubling development. Mortals, who had gained access to Asgardian-level power through mystical means, but who lacked any of the cultural conditioning or ethical training that normally accompanied such abilities. Dirk Garthwaite had been a demolition worker before his transformation, a man whose understanding of power was limited to its most basic applications, the tearing down of existing structures without consideration for what might be built in their place. When he gained access to enchanted tools that had been empowered by Asgardian magic, he became capable of literally reshaping reality through the application of crude force, guided by equally crude thinking. The wrecking crew's approach to problem-solving was disturbingly effective in its simplicity. When faced with obstacles, they simply destroyed them, regardless of the broader consequences or the possibility that those obstacles might have been serving important protective functions. Their battles with Thor were exercises in controlled chaos, requiring him to simultaneously defend innocent bystanders while also preventing the crew from accidentally triggering disasters that could affect entire continents. "We don't need to understand how this stuff works," Thunderball explained during one of their confrontations, his enchanted wrecking ball carving through dimensional barriers as if they were tissue paper. "We just need to know that it works, and that nobody can stop us when we put our minds to breaking things." The threat they represented was not merely physical but cultural. They embodied the potential for advanced power to be wielded by beings who had no understanding of the responsibilities that came with such abilities. Their conflicts with Thor forced him to confront uncomfortable questions about the democratization of cosmic forces and the dangers inherent in making divine-level capabilities accessible to unprepared minds. Yet even as he fought against their destructive activities, Thor found himself strangely sympathetic to their underlying motivations. They were not evil in the traditional sense, but rather beings who had been given tools they could not properly use while living in a society that had provided them with no meaningful outlets for their aggressive instincts or practical skills. The resolution of their conflicts required Thor to work closely with Earth's educational and social service institutions, developing programs that could provide alternatives to purely destructive applications of enhanced abilities. It was slow, patient work that required him to apply the healing skills he had learned as Donald Blake to social problems rather than individual patients. Each of these conflicts, whether mystical, technological, or cosmic in nature, contributed to Thor's growing understanding of his role as a bridge between different levels of existence. He was not merely Asgard's representative to Midgard or Earth's champion against cosmic threats, but a being whose unique combination of experiences and perspectives allowed him to serve as a translator between realms that might otherwise remain forever isolated from each other. The enemies he faced were not simply obstacles to be overcome, but teachers whose opposition forced him to develop new capabilities and deeper wisdom. Through conflict with the Enchantress, he learned to resist manipulation while remaining open to genuine connection. Through his battles with Ulik, he discovered how to honor the warrior tradition while channeling it toward constructive purposes. The absorbing man taught him to appreciate mortal ingenuity and adapt his ancient methods to contemporary challenges. Surtur's cosmic opposition forced him to grapple with questions of destiny and free will that would have been beyond his comprehension during his youth, while the Wrecking Crew's crude but effective approach to problem-solving reminded him that power without wisdom was dangerous, regardless of its source or magnitude. But perhaps most importantly, these enemies served as mirrors that reflected different aspects of Thor's own character. The potential for corruption that existed within his noble nature, the warrior's hunger for glorious battle that had to be constantly balanced against his responsibilities as a protector, the temptation to solve problems through overwhelming force rather than patient understanding. Through facing these reflected shadows of himself, Thor gradually became worthy not just of Mjolnir's power, but of the cosmic role that destiny had prepared for him. He was no longer the proud prince who had fallen from grace through arrogance and impatience, but a being who had learned to wield divine power in service of values that transcended personal ambition or cultural prejudice. The battles with myth and cosmos had forged him into something new, a hero whose strength was tempered by wisdom, whose power was guided by compassion, and whose divine nature was balanced by deep understanding of mortal concerns and limitations. The enemies he had faced would return again and again, for such conflicts are eternal in their nature, but each encounter would find him better prepared and more deeply committed to the principles that made him truly worthy of the title God of Thunder. In the deepest vaults of Asgard, where the accumulated wisdom of millennia gathered dust in crystalline repositories that existed partially outside of normal space-time, ancient texts spoke of endings that were also beginnings, of destructions so complete they became acts of creation. The Norse concept of Ragnarok was not merely a prophecy of doom, but a sophisticated understanding of cosmic cycles that governed the birth, growth, maturity, and renewal of entire reality systems. Thor had grown up with these prophecies as background knowledge, the way mortal children absorb cultural stories without fully comprehending their deeper implications. The twilight of the gods was a distant eventuality, something that concerned scholars and seers but held little relevance for a young prince whose primary interests involved mastering weapons and proving himself worthy of his divine heritage. Ragnarok was tomorrow's problem, safely relegated to a future so remote that it need not influence today's decisions. But as Thor's understanding of cosmic forces deepened through his conflicts with entities like Surtur, and his growing awareness of the interconnections between seemingly distant realms, the prophecies began to take on a more immediate and troubling significance. Each victory he achieved, each crisis he averted, seemed to create ripples that flowed inexorably toward the conditions described in the ancient texts. The very heroism that defined his character was becoming a force that accelerated the approach of cosmic catastrophe. The first clear sign that the Ragnarok cycle was beginning to manifest came through Baldur the Beautiful, Thor's uncle and one of the most beloved figures in all of Asgard. Baldur had always possessed a degree of prophetic sensitivity that surpassed even the trained seers of the royal court, but his visions had traditionally been focused on immediate events and local consequences rather than cosmic-scale developments. The change in his dreams was subtle at first, brief flashes of images that seemed disconnected from any coherent narrative, fragments of possible futures that flickered through his sleeping mind like scattered lightning. But gradually, these visions began to coalesce into patterns that carried the unmistakable weight of genuine prophecy, scenes of devastation and renewal that matched the classical descriptions of Ragnarok with terrifying precision. "I see the golden halls empty," Baldur confided to Thor during one of their private conversations, his normally radiant features shadowed with the burden of unwelcome knowledge. The rainbow bridge shattered, its fragments scattered across the cosmic void like broken promises. The tree of worlds withering at its roots, while new growth struggles to emerge from soil enriched by the decay of everything we have known and loved. The specific details of Baldur's visions were less troubling than their emotional resonance, the profound sense of loss they carried, but also the underlying current of hope that suggested Ragnarok was not merely an ending, but a transformation. The classical texts had always been ambiguous on this point, describing the twilight of the gods in language that could be interpreted either as ultimate destruction or as the necessary prelude to cosmic renewal. Thor's attempts to understand these prophecies led him deeper into Asgard's mystical archives, where he studied texts that had been written by seers whose names were lost to history, beings who had witnessed previous cosmic cycles, and recorded their observations for future generations. What he discovered there challenged many of his fundamental assumptions about the nature of destiny and the role of individual choice in shaping cosmic events. The Ragnarok cycle was not, according to these ancient sources, a single catastrophic event, but rather a process that unfolded across eons, involving countless individual decisions and actions that accumulated into the critical mass necessary for reality-wide transformation. Each act of heroism, each victory of order over chaos, each moment when cosmic forces were balanced against their opposites, contributed to the vast equation that would eventually determine when and how the current reality system would conclude. This understanding was both liberating and terrifying. On one hand, it meant that Ragnarok was not an arbitrary fate imposed by cosmic forces beyond mortal comprehension, but rather the natural consequence of countless individual choices made by conscious beings exercising their free will. On the other hand, it suggested that Thor's very efforts to protect and preserve the Nine Realms might be inadvertently hastening the approach of their ultimate transformation. The philosophical implications kept him awake during the long nights when Asgard's artificial suns dimmed to simulate the darkness that the Golden City had never truly known. If heroic action accelerated the cosmic cycle, did that make heroism itself a form of cosmic vandalism? If preserving the current order hastened its eventual replacement, what moral obligations did that create for those with the power to influence such vast processes? The answer, when it finally came to him, required a fundamental shift in how he understood the nature of heroism itself. The goal was not to prevent change or preserve any particular configuration of reality indefinitely, but rather to ensure that whatever changes occurred served the cause of justice and the protection of innocent lives. Ragnarok might be inevitable, but the form it took could still be influenced by the choices made by those who participated in its unfolding. This realization coincided with the emergence of new threats that seemed specifically designed to test Thor's commitment to this more sophisticated understanding of heroic responsibility. The Mangog appeared from the spaces between dimensions, a being of such concentrated rage and destructive potential that its very existence seemed to violate the fundamental laws that governed stable reality. The creature claimed to be the embodiment of vengeance itself, not the justified anger of wronged individuals seeking redress, but the pure concept of retribution divorced from any specific grievance or moral framework. Its hatred for Odin and Asgard was cosmic in scope, based not on particular wrongs that had been committed, but on the very fact that order and civilization existed in a universe that the Mangog believed should be consumed by primordial chaos. "I am the end that awaits all tyrants," the creature declared during their first encounter, its voice resonating through dimensions that had no names in any mortal language. "I am the price that must be paid for every moment of peace, every instant of prosperity, every heartbeat of happiness that has been stolen from the cosmic chaos that is existence's natural state." The battles against the Mangog were unlike anything Thor had previously experienced, because they were not really battles in any conventional sense. The creature could not be defeated through superior force or overcome through tactical brilliance, because it was not fundamentally a physical entity, but rather a manifestation of abstract principles that existed independently of any particular form or location. Each time Thor struck down the Mangog's current manifestation, it would simply reconstitute itself from the background rage and resentment that permeated the cosmic environment, drawing strength from every act of injustice and every moment of suffering that existed anywhere in the Nine Realms. The only way to truly defeat it would be to eliminate all sources of anger and hatred from the universe, a goal that was not only impossible but would arguably be undesirable even if it could be achieved. Thor's eventual triumph over the Mangog came not through destruction, but through understanding the recognition that the creature's existence served a necessary function in the cosmic order, providing an outlet for the destructive energies that would otherwise accumulate to levels that could threaten reality itself. By acknowledging the MALEKITH'S role while also containing its more destructive manifestations, Thor learned to work with cosmic forces rather than simply opposing them. This lesson proved crucial when he encountered the Destroyer, a mechanical construct that had been created by Odin himself as the ultimate expression of divine power turned toward protective purposes. The Destroyer was designed to be an absolutely unstoppable force when activated, capable of annihilating any threat, regardless of its power level or cosmic significance. But the construct's activation required that its user be willing to sacrifice their own life force to power its operation, making it a weapon of absolute last resort that could only be employed when the survival of Asgard itself was at stake. The very existence of such a device spoke to Odin's understanding that there might come circumstances when even the All-Father's considerable power would prove insufficient to protect his realm and people. Thor's encounter with the Destroyer came about when the construct was activated by hostile forces who had learned to bypass its protective mechanisms, turning Odin's ultimate weapon against the very realm it had been designed to protect. The irony was bitter and instructive. The most perfect expression of defensive capability had become the most dangerous threat Asgard had ever faced, precisely because its power was so absolute that conventional defensive measures were useless against it. The battle to stop the Destroyer required Thor to master techniques that went beyond simple combat skills or even advanced magical theory. He had to learn to think like his father, to understand the philosophical principles that had guided the construct's creation, and find ways to use those same principles to limit its destructive potential. "You cannot destroy the Destroyer," Odin explained when Thor sought his guidance in this crisis. "It was designed to be immune to every form of force that could conceivably be brought against it. But perhaps it can be convinced to destroy itself, if the right conditions are created." The solution that Thor eventually developed required him to present the Destroyer with a logical paradox that its mechanical intelligence could not resolve a scenario in which its programmed directive to protect Asgard could only be fulfilled by ceasing its own operation. The process was neither elegant nor entirely satisfying, but it demonstrated the power of intellectual approach to problems that could not be solved through force alone. These experiences with entities that existed at the borderline between cosmic principles and individual manifestations prepared Thor for his eventual encounter with the true harbingers of Ragnarok beings, whose very nature embodied a transition between the current cosmic order and whatever would replace it. The Midgard's serpent, Jormungandr, represented perhaps the most significant of these transitional entities. The world serpent had been growing in the depths of Earth's oceans since time immemorial, its coils gradually encircling the entire planet in patterns that followed the flow of mystical energy through Midgard's core. According to the prophecies, Jormungandr would eventually grow large enough to grasp its own tail, and when that moment arrived, the resulting release of accumulated cosmic force would trigger the events that led directly to Ragnarok. Thor's relationship with the serpent was complex and deeply personal, because the creature was not merely a cosmic force, but also, in some sense, a member of his extended family. Jormungandr was one of Loki's children, born from his brother's union with the giantess Angbada during one of his earlier phases of rebellion against Asgardian authority. The prophecies indicated that Thor and Jormungandr were destined to destroy each other during the final battles of Ragnarok, a fate that the god of thunder found deeply troubling, not because he feared death, but because it suggested that his own familial conflicts would ultimately become the mechanism through which cosmic catastrophe was triggered. Their encounters, when they occurred, were not battles in any conventional sense, but rather tragic confrontations between beings who were bound by destiny to oppose each other despite having no personal animosity. The serpent was not evil in any meaningful sense. It was simply fulfilling its cosmic function, growing toward the moment when its size would trigger the next phase of the universal cycle. "We need not be enemies," Thor told the great creature during one of their meetings, standing on the surface of the ocean, while the serpent's massive form created whirlpools that extended for miles in every direction. The prophecies speak of what may come to pass, not what must inevitably occur. Perhaps there are paths to renewal that do not require mutual destruction. Jormungandr's response was wordless but profound, a shift in its position that created tidal patterns carrying meanings that could only be understood through mystical interpretation. The serpent acknowledged the possibility of alternative outcomes, while also expressing its commitment to fulfilling its cosmic role regardless of personal preferences or family loyalties. This exchange crystallized Thor's understanding of his own position in the Ragnarok cycle. He was not merely a passive victim of cosmic forces or an unwilling participant in predetermined events, but rather an active agent whose choices would help determine the specific form that universal renewal would take. The prophecies described potential outcomes rather than fixed destinations, and his actions could influence which of those potentials would ultimately manifest. The weight of this responsibility was almost overwhelming, but it was also liberating in its implications. If the future remained malleable, then heroic action retained its meaning even in the face of cosmic inevitability. The goal was not to prevent Ragnarok, which might well be neither possible nor desirable, but to ensure that when transformation came, it would serve the cause of justice and the protection of innocent life. As Thor contemplated these revelations, standing on the threshold between the current age and whatever would follow it, he began to understand that the first whispers of Ragnarok were not harbingers of doom, but invitations to participate in the greatest act of heroism imaginable, the conscious, deliberate shaping of cosmic destiny in service of values that transcended any particular reality system. The twilight of the gods was approaching, but it would not find the Nine Realms unprepared or undefended. Thor had learned to hear the music hidden within the prophecies of ending, and that music spoke not of destruction but of transformation, not of loss but of renewal, not of endings but of beginnings that would justify every sacrifice required to achieve them. The rainbow bridge stretched before Thor like a pathway woven from crystallized starlight, its prismatic surface reflecting not just the visible spectrum, but wavelengths of energy that existed beyond mortal perception. Each step upon Bifrost was a journey through dimensions that folded space and time according to principles that even Asgardian science could only partially comprehend. As the god of thunder traveled between the Nine Realms, on missions that ranged from diplomatic necessity to cosmic emergency, he began to understand that his role as a bridge between worlds carried responsibilities far greater than he had ever imagined. The realms themselves were not simply different planets or dimensions, but complete reality systems that operated according to their own physical laws and cultural principles. Each represented a different approach to existence itself, different answers to the fundamental questions of how conscious beings should relate to their environment, to each other, and to the cosmic forces that shaped their destinies. Alfheim, the realm of the Light Elves, was perhaps the most alien to Thor's warrior sensibilities, despite its obvious beauty. Here, everything existed in perfect harmony, not the static perfection of death, but the dynamic balance of a reality system that had learned to maintain itself through constant, subtle adjustments that prevented any element from growing dominant enough to disrupt the whole. The Light Elves themselves were beings of such ethereal beauty that looking upon them for extended periods could cause sensory overload in visitors from more physical realms. Their bodies seemed to be composed of crystallized light, given form and consciousness, capable of shifting between states of matter and energy according to their emotional and spiritual needs. They communicated through harmonics that carried meaning on multiple levels simultaneously, conveying not just information but emotional context and philosophical framework in ways that made conventional language seem crude and inadequate. Thor's diplomatic missions to Alfheim were exercises in patience and cultural sensitivity that tested every lesson he had learned about the importance of understanding others, rather than simply imposing his own values upon them. The Light Elves operated on temporal scales that made Asgardian deliberations seem hasty. By comparison, their decision-making processes could span centuries, with each choice being examined from every conceivable angle before any action was taken. "You bring the storm with you wherever you go," observed Losalfgrim, one of the few Light Elves who had learned to communicate in forms that other beings could understand. "Even when you seek peace, your very presence creates turbulence in the harmonic patterns that maintain our realm's stability." This is not criticism, it is simply observation of fundamental incompatibility between your nature and ours. The challenge was to find ways to accomplish necessary diplomatic objectives without disrupting Alfheim's delicate balance. Thor learned to modulate not just his voice and actions, but his very life force, dampening the electrical activity that surrounded him and consciously controlling the emotional emanations that were as much a part of his divine nature as his physical strength. These visits to Alfheim taught him crucial lessons about the diversity of approaches to cosmic harmony. Where Asgard maintained order through strength and justice, the Light Elves achieved stability through consensus and patience. Neither approach was inherently superior, but each represented a valid response to the challenges of existence that could inform and enrich the others. The contrast with Nidavellir could not have been more dramatic. The realm of the Dark Elves, more properly called the Dwarves, though they bore little resemblance to the diminutive figures of mortal folklore, was a dimension where the fundamental forces of creation were harnessed directly through technology that merged advanced engineering with mystical principles that predated the current cosmic order. The dwarven forges existed partially outside normal space-time, allowing their master craftsmen to work with materials and energies that were drawn from the cosmic foundries, where stars were born and elements were first crystallized from primordial chaos. The workshop where Mjolnir had been created was only one of thousands of such facilities, each specializing in different aspects of the reality-shaping arts that the dwarves had perfected across eons of dedicated practice. Eitri, the master smith who had personally overseen Mjolnir's creation, received Thor with the mixture of professional pride and artistic criticism that marked all interactions with his people. The dwarves respected power, but only when it was wielded with the same precision and attention to detail that they brought to their own work. "Your hammer serves you well," Eitri observed during one of Thor's visits, his massive hands, each finger thick as a mortal's arm, running over Mjolnir's surface with the delicate touch of a craftsman examining his own creation. "But you use perhaps 10% of its true capabilities. The enchantments woven into its structure contain possibilities that you have not yet learned to access, forces that could reshape reality itself if properly understood and applied." These visits to Nidavellir became advanced education in the deeper mysteries of cosmic craftsmanship, lessons that went far beyond simple weapon maintenance to encompass fundamental principles of how conscious will could be made manifest through properly constructed artifacts. Thor learned to perceive Mjolnir not just as a tool for channeling his own power, but as a sophisticated instrument, capable of manipulating the basic forces that governed reality itself. The dwarves taught him techniques for attuning his consciousness to the hammer's mystical resonances, methods for accessing the stored knowledge and accumulated experience that had been woven into its Uru metal matrix during the forging process. He discovered that Mjolnir contained not just power but wisdom, the collective understanding of every master craftsman who had contributed to its creation, available to any wielder who possessed the patience and skill necessary to access it. But perhaps more importantly, the dwarves helped him understand the relationship between creation and destruction that lay at the heart of all meaningful work. Every act of forging required the breaking down of existing materials and their reconstruction in new forms, a process that paralleled the cosmic cycles of death and renewal that governed the universe itself. To create, one must first destroy, Eitri explained as they worked together in the cosmic forges, their combined efforts shaping matter and energy according to patterns that existed in the realm of pure possibility. But destruction without purpose is mere waste, while creation without understanding is chaos. The art lies in knowing what to preserve, what to transform, and what to release back into the cosmic currents from which all things emerge. These philosophical insights proved crucial when Thor encountered the more challenging aspects of inter-realm diplomacy. His missions to Jotunheim were particularly complex, requiring him to navigate the bitter legacy of ancient wars, while also addressing current threats that endangered all the 9 realms. The frost giants had never fully accepted their defeat at Odin's hands, but neither had they been completely crushed by Asgardian military might. Instead, they had retreated into the deepest recesses of their ice-locked realm, where they nursed grievances and plotted various forms of revenge that ranged from the merely destructive to the cosmically catastrophic. Laufey, the frost giant king who was also Loki's biological father, represented the most moderate faction among his people, those who believed that accommodation with Asgard was possible if proper respect was shown for Jotunheim's sovereignty and cultural traditions. But even Laufey's moderation was shaped by centuries of humiliation and resentment that made every diplomatic interaction a potential spark for renewed warfare. "You come to us as conquerors, offering mercy," Laufey observed during one particularly tense negotiation, his massive form radiating cold that turned the air itself into visible crystalline patterns. "You speak of peace while wearing the hammer that has shattered our fortresses and scattered our armies. How are we to interpret such gestures? What meaning can your words carry when they are backed by the same force that has been used to crush our aspirations for generations?" Thor's response required him to draw upon every lesson he had learned about the nature of true strength and the responsibilities that came with power. He could not simply deny the reality of Asgard's military dominance, or pretend that past conflicts had not created lasting wounds. Instead, he had to find ways to acknowledge the legitimacy of frost giant grievances, while also addressing the current threats that made renewed cooperation essential for all parties. The solution, when it emerged, involved a fundamental restructuring of the relationship between the realms, not the simple dominance and submission that had characterized previous arrangements, but a more complex alliance that recognized each realm's unique contributions to cosmic stability, while also establishing mechanisms for resolving conflicts without resort to warfare. These diplomatic innovations were tested severely when cosmic threats began to emerge that dwarfed any merely local conflicts between realms. The first clear indication that forces beyond the 9 realms were taking an interest in Thor's activities came through encounters with entities that existed on scales so vast that normal concepts of space and time became meaningless in their presence. Galactus, the world devourer, represented the ultimate expression of cosmic force divorced from moral considerations. The entity was not evil in any meaningful sense. Its consumption of planets was simply a biological necessity, as natural and inevitable as a mortal's need for food. But the scale of that necessity made Galactus an existential threat to every inhabited world in the universe, a force that could not be reasoned with or reformed but could only be diverted or delayed. Thor's first encounter with the Devourer of Worlds came when Galactus's attention was drawn to Earth by the unusual concentration of cosmic energies that had been generated by recent superheroic activities. The entity's arrival was preceded by the appearance of his herald, the Silver Surfer, whose tragic nobility and reluctant service to his world-destroying master created moral complexities that challenged every assumption Thor had developed about the nature of heroism and sacrifice. "I serve because I must," the Silver Surfer explained during their initial confrontation, his cosmic board carrying him through dimensional spaces that normal matter could not traverse. "My homeworld lives because I accepted this burden, because I chose to save one world by helping to doom countless others. Judge me if you will, but understand that every choice available to me carried its own form of damnation." The philosophical questions raised by the Silver Surfer's situation were profound and troubling. If one possessed the power to save innocent lives, what moral obligations did that create? How could one weigh the certain destruction of unknown worlds against the definite preservation of one's own people? Was there any meaningful difference between active participation in atrocity and passive acceptance of tragedy? Thor's resolution of the Galactus crisis required him to think beyond traditional concepts of victory and defeat. The world devourer could not be destroyed; its cosmic function was too essential to universal stability. But perhaps it could be convinced to modify its methods, to find ways of satisfying its needs that did not require the complete annihilation of inhabited worlds. The solution that Thor and Earth's other heroes eventually developed involved redirecting Galactus's attention toward uninhabited planets, rich in the specific types of energy the entity required, while also beginning research into alternative sources that might eventually eliminate the need for planetary consumption entirely. It was not a perfect resolution, but it demonstrated the power of creative thinking when applied to seemingly impossible problems. But perhaps more significantly, the Galactus encounter established Thor as a figure of cosmic importance, someone whose actions and decisions could influence events on scales that encompassed entire galactic clusters. This new status brought with it responsibilities and challenges that far exceeded anything he had previously faced. The cosmic community that Thor gradually became aware of was vast beyond imagination, containing entities and civilizations that operated according to principles that challenged every assumption about the nature of existence itself. The Watchers observed but never interfered, accumulating knowledge across eons while maintaining perfect neutrality in conflicts that could determine the fate of reality itself. The Celestials pursued agendas that spanned millions of years, conducting experiments that treated entire species as laboratory subjects in investigations that no mortal mind could fully comprehend. Thor's position in this cosmic hierarchy was unique and complex. As an Asgardian, he represented a culture that had achieved a balance between physical power and mystical wisdom that few civilizations could match. As a protector of Earth, he spoke for a world whose inhabitants possessed a combination of creativity and moral complexity that made them significant despite their relative technological primitiveness. But perhaps most importantly, as someone who had experienced both divine power and mortal limitation, he could serve as a translator between different levels of existence, helping cosmic entities understand the concerns of planetary civilizations, while also preparing local defenders for challenges that operated on interstellar scales. This translational role became crucial during the various crises that followed, each one testing different aspects of Thor's growing cosmic awareness. When the stranger arrived seeking specimens for his interdimensional research, Thor had to balance the entity's legitimate scientific interests against the rights of the beings he wished to study. When the collector attempted to acquire Earth's most unique individuals for his vast archive, Thor found himself negotiating the fine line between preservation and imprisonment. Each of these encounters taught him new lessons about the complexity of cosmic ethics and the dangers of imposing simple moral frameworks upon situations that transcended normal categories of understanding. The universe was vast enough to contain multiple valid approaches to existence, but it was also interconnected enough that actions taken in one realm could have consequences that rippled across dimensions and influenced the destiny of beings who might never even learn of their existence. As Thor's understanding of these cosmic interconnections deepened, he began to recognize patterns that suggested the approach of events far more significant than any individual crisis or conflict. The various threats and challenges he had faced were not random occurrences, but symptoms of larger instabilities in the cosmic order, signs that the current age was approaching its natural conclusion, and that forces were gathering that would determine the shape of whatever era would follow. The journey into mystery had revealed mysteries within mysteries, each answer leading to new questions that challenged the very foundations of understanding. But it had also prepared Thor for the trials that lay ahead, giving him the knowledge and perspective necessary to play his role in the cosmic drama that was beginning to unfold across all the 9 realms and beyond. The god of thunder had become a citizen of the cosmos, but he had not forgotten his origins or abandoned his commitments to those who depended upon his protection. The journey through the realms had taught him that true heroism required understanding the larger context within which individual actions took place. But it had also confirmed that the ultimate test of any philosophy was its ability to protect and serve those who could not protect themselves. The realms beckoned with their infinite complexity and their eternal mysteries, but Thor's path led not away from responsibility but deeper into it, toward challenges that would require everything he had learned and more than he yet knew he possessed. The first signs of Malekith's grand campaign appeared as subtle distortions in the fabric of reality itself. Shadows that fell at impossible angles, reflections that showed scenes from distant dimensions, and whispers that carried across the void between worlds in languages that predated the current cosmic order. For months, these anomalies were dismissed as minor fluctuations in the mystical forces that bound the 9 realms together, temporary instabilities that would resolve themselves through the natural processes of cosmic self-correction. But Thor's growing sensitivity to interdimensional phenomena, honed through his extensive travels and cosmic encounters, detected patterns within these disturbances that spoke of deliberate manipulation rather than random fluctuation. The anomalies were too precisely placed, too carefully timed, too strategically positioned to be anything other than the preliminary moves in a campaign of unprecedented scope and ambition. Malekith, the Accursed, had been planning his war for millennia, ever since his people's defeat during the ancient conflicts that had established Asgardian dominance over the Nine Realms. The Dark Elves of Svartalfheim had once been among the most powerful and technologically advanced civilizations in the known universe, masters of sciences that blended physical manipulation with mystical force in ways that few other cultures had ever achieved. Their fall from cosmic prominence had been complete and devastating, reducing them from galactic powers to refugees hiding in the deepest shadows of their ruined realm. But Malekith had never accepted this diminishment as permanent. Instead, he had used the long centuries of exile to study the weaknesses in Asgard's cosmic empire and to develop strategies that could exploit those vulnerabilities with surgical precision. The Dark Elf King understood something that many of Asgard's enemies had failed to grasp. The Nine Realms were not separate worlds connected by mystical bridges, but components of a single vast mechanism whose stability depended upon carefully maintained balances of power and influence. Disrupt those balances in the right way, at the right time, and the entire system could be made to collapse inward upon itself. His strategy was elegantly simple in concept, but devastatingly complex in execution. Rather than attempting to challenge Asgard's military might directly, Malekith would systematically corrupt and capture each of the other realms, turning Odin's own empire against itself, while building an alliance of the conquered that could eventually overwhelm even the Golden City's legendary defenses. The campaign began in Alfheim, where Malekith's forces struck with precision that spoke of detailed intelligence gathering and careful preparation. The Light Elves' commitment to harmony and consensus made them vulnerable to infiltration tactics that exploited their reluctance to take decisive action against threats that had not yet manifested overtly hostile intentions. Dark Elf infiltrators had spent decades establishing themselves within Alfheim's social structures, presenting themselves as refugees seeking asylum from Svartalfheim's harsh conditions. Their patient work bore fruit when they simultaneously activated sophisticated reality distortion devices that turned the Light Elves' own harmonious nature against them, creating feedback loops that amplified their peaceful impulses into complete paralysis. By the time Alfheim's leaders recognized what was happening, their realm had been effectively neutralized, not destroyed, but transformed into a staging ground for further operations. The Light Elves were not killed or enslaved, but rather placed into a form of mystical stasis that preserved their lives while preventing any resistance to Malekith's plans. Thor's discovery of Alfheim's fate came too late to prevent the initial conquest, but it provided crucial intelligence about the scope and sophistication of the threat facing all the realms. The attack had been executed with a level of strategic thinking that surpassed anything the Dark Elves had previously demonstrated, suggesting that Malekith had evolved far beyond the crude conqueror that Asgardian military doctrine had prepared to face. "This is not invasion," Thor reported to the Asgardian War Council, his voice heavy with the implications of what he had witnessed. "This is transformation, the systematic conversion of each realm into a component of some larger mechanism that we do not yet understand. Alfheim still exists, but it now serves Malekith's purposes rather than its own." Odin's response was swift and decisive, mobilizing Asgardian forces for what promised to be the most challenging military campaign since the original conquest of the Nine Realms. But the All-Father's strategy was hampered by incomplete intelligence about Malekith's true capabilities and objectives, forcing Asgard to react to events rather than shape them. The second phase of Malekith's campaign targeted Nidavellir, where the strategic objective was not conquest, but control over the cosmic forges that produce the most advanced weapons and artifacts in the known universe. The Dark Elves could not hope to match the dwarves' craftsmanship through conventional means, but they possessed something equally valuable: detailed knowledge of the mystical principles that governed the forging process. The attack on Nidavellir was a masterpiece of technological warfare that combined Dark Elf reality manipulation techniques with captured Light Elf harmonic technologies and weapon systems that had been developed in the deepest vaults of Svartalfheim. The result was a form of warfare that operated on multiple dimensional levels simultaneously, attacking not just the physical infrastructure of the Dwarven realm, but the conceptual foundations that allowed their technology to function. Eitri and his master smiths found themselves fighting a war where their most powerful weapons simply ceased to function, where the cosmic forces they had mastered for eons suddenly obeyed different rules, where the very principles of creation and destruction that they had spent millennia learning to control were turned against them by enemies who understood those principles from completely different perspectives. Thor's arrival in Nidavellir came during the height of the battle, as Dark Elf forces pressed their assault against the primary forge complexes, where the most crucial artifacts were produced. The scene that greeted him was unlike anything he had experienced. Warfare conducted across multiple dimensions simultaneously, with combatants phasing between different levels of reality as they sought tactical advantages that conventional military thinking could not provide. "They know our methods too well," Eitri gasped as he and Thor fought back-to-back against enemies whose very presence caused the cosmic fires to burn in alien colors. "Every technique we use, every principle we apply, they have found ways to corrupt or subvert. It is as if they possess perfect knowledge of our deepest secrets." The revelation that followed was both illuminating and deeply troubling. Malekith's forces included dark elves who had once studied in Nidavellir as legitimate apprentices, individuals who had gained access to dwarven secrets through centuries of patient infiltration and careful relationship building. The intelligence gathering that had preceded the actual invasion was so comprehensive that the attackers understood their target's capabilities better than the defenders understood their own vulnerabilities. Thor's intervention in the battle for Nidavellir required him to employ techniques that went beyond conventional combat, drawing upon his growing understanding of cosmic forces to counter reality manipulation effects that threatened to unmake the very foundations of the Dwarven realm. Working alongside Eitri and the other master smiths, he helped develop rapid countermeasures that could neutralize the most dangerous Dark Elf technologies, while preserving the cosmic forges that were essential to the defense of all the realms. But even as they achieved tactical victories against immediate threats, the strategic situation continued to deteriorate. Reports flooded in from across the 9 realms, each one describing new Dark Elf operations that demonstrated the incredible scope and coordination of Malekith's campaign. Vanaheim was under assault by forces that seemed to emerge from the realm's own natural features, as if the very landscape had been turned against its inhabitants. Muspelheim was experiencing coordinated attacks by entities that wielded ice and shadow against the fire giant's traditional flame-based defenses. Even Jotunheim, despite its traditional hostility toward Asgard, was facing invasions that threatened to exterminate the frost giant civilization entirely. The pattern that emerged from these reports was clear and terrifying in its implications. Malekith was not simply conquering the 9 realms. He was systematically destroying the cultural and technological foundations that made each realm unique, replacing them with standardized systems that served his larger strategic objectives. The true scope of his plan became apparent when Thor received an urgent summons from Midgard, where Dr. Jane Foster and her research team had detected massive dimensional anomalies centered on several major Earth cities. The War of the Realms was not limited to the traditional 9 Malekith, intended to extend his campaign to every dimension that was connected to the cosmic tree of Yggdrasil, including the mortal realm that Thor had sworn to protect. The invasion of Earth began with the systematic targeting of the planet's most significant mystical and technological centers, as Dark Elf forces sought to eliminate the defensive capabilities that Earth's heroes had developed over the years. New York, London, Tokyo, and a dozen other major cities found themselves simultaneously under assault by enemies that emerged from dimensional rifts that had been carefully positioned to maximize strategic impact while minimizing the defenders' ability to coordinate their responses. But Malekith had underestimated the resilience and adaptability of Earth's superhero community. Unlike the more traditional civilizations of the 9 realms, Earth's defenders had been forged through exposure to constant crisis and challenge, developing tactical flexibility and innovative problem-solving approaches that were difficult for even sophisticated enemies to predict or counter. Thor's reunion with the Avengers came in the midst of the battle for Manhattan, where Captain America was coordinating a desperate defense against Dark Elf forces that had seized control of several key buildings and were using them as staging areas for further operations. The sight of his mortal allies fighting with such courage and determination against cosmic-level threats filled Thor with a mixture of pride and desperate urgency. "We've been holding them off," Captain America reported, as they fought their way through streets that had been transformed into alien battlefields. "But their technology is unlike anything we've faced before. They're not just attacking our defenses, they're rewriting the rules that make our defenses possible." The observation was astute and strategically crucial. Malekith's forces were employing reality manipulation techniques that were specifically designed to neutralize the technological and mystical advantages that Earth's heroes typically relied upon. Iron Man's advanced systems were experiencing systematic failures that defied conventional diagnosis, while even Dr. Strange's mystical defenses were being undermined by alterations to the fundamental magical principles that govern dimensional interactions. Thor's response drew upon every lesson he had learned during his travels through the realms and his growing understanding of cosmic forces. Working with Earth's scientific and mystical communities, he helped develop countermeasures that could restore the stability necessary for conventional defensive systems to function, while also coordinating with off-world allies who could provide reinforcements and alternative technological approaches. The alliance that formed in response to Malekith's invasion was unprecedented in its scope and diversity. Asgardian warriors fought alongside human soldiers and scientists, while light elves, who had escaped Alfheim's conquest, provided crucial intelligence about dark elf capabilities and weaknesses. Dwarven master smiths worked frantically to produce weapons and defensive systems that could function despite reality distortion effects, while Earth's heroes applied their hard-won experience with impossible challenges to problems that defied conventional solutions. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the alliance was the way it forced different cultures and civilizations to truly understand each other for the first time. Thor found himself serving not just as a military leader but as a cultural translator, helping beings from vastly different backgrounds find common ground and develop trust despite their fundamental differences in approach and perspective. The turning point in the War of the Realms came when the Alliance discovered the true nature of Malekith's ultimate objective. The Dark Elf King was not simply seeking to conquer territory or accumulate power for its own sake. He was attempting to fundamentally restructure the cosmic order itself, replacing the current system of independent realms with a unified empire that would operate according to Dark Elf principles and serve Dark Elf interests exclusively. The weapon he had developed to achieve this goal was a reality restructuring device that could rewrite the basic laws governing interdimensional relationships, effectively making him the supreme authority over all connected realms. The device required massive amounts of mystical energy to operate, which explained his systematic conquest of each realm he needed to control their magical infrastructure in order to power his cosmic transformation engine. Thor's discovery of this plan came through intelligence provided by Loki, whose own complex motivations had led him to infiltrate Malekith's organization, while maintaining the appearance of serving his own ambitions. The information was delivered through channels so convoluted that even Thor was not entirely certain of his brother's true loyalties, but its accuracy was confirmed by subsequent events. "He means to unmake everything," Loki explained during a clandestine meeting that took place in a pocket dimension accessible only through techniques that both brothers had learned during their youth. "Every culture, every tradition, every way of life that does not serve his vision will be simply edited out of existence, not destroyed, erased, as if they had never been." The implications were staggering. If Malekith succeeded, the rich diversity of cultures and approaches to existence that characterized the 9 realms would be replaced by a single, homogeneous system that reflected only Dark Elf values and priorities. Billions of beings would not just lose their freedom, they would lose their very identity, becoming components in a vast machine designed to serve objectives they could never understand or accept. The final battle against Malekith's forces was fought simultaneously across multiple dimensions, as the Alliance sought to prevent the activation of his reality restructuring device, while also liberating the realms that had already fallen under his control. Thor found himself at the center of conflicts that spanned scales from individual combat to cosmic warfare, requiring him to coordinate strategies that involved everything from street-level tactics to interdimensional mysticism. The victory, when it came, was hard-won and costly. Malekith's device was destroyed, but not before its partial activation had caused permanent alterations to several realms that would require centuries to fully understand and address. The Dark Elf King himself escaped destruction, but his power base had been shattered and his grand plan permanently disrupted. Perhaps more importantly, the War of the Realms had forged connections between different civilizations that would endure long after the immediate crisis had passed. The alliance that had formed to face Malekith's threat evolved into ongoing relationships that would provide stability and mutual support for generations to come. Thor's role in these events established him as more than just Asgard's champion or Earth's protector. He had become a figure of cosmic significance, whose actions and decisions could influence the destiny of entire reality systems. But with that recognition came responsibilities that would test every aspect of his character and wisdom in the trials that lay ahead. The War of the Realms was over, but its consequences would shape the future of the cosmos for eons to come. The first signs of Malekith's grand campaign appeared as subtle distortions in the fabric of reality itself, shadows that fell at impossible angles, reflections that showed scenes from distant dimensions, and whispers that carried across the void between worlds in languages that predated the current cosmic order. For months, these anomalies were dismissed as minor fluctuations in the mystical forces that bound the 9 realms together, temporary instabilities that would resolve themselves through the natural processes of cosmic self-correction. But Thor's growing sensitivity to interdimensional phenomena, honed through his extensive travels and cosmic encounters, detected patterns within these disturbances that spoke of deliberate manipulation rather than random fluctuation. The anomalies were too precisely placed, too carefully timed, too strategically positioned to be anything other than the preliminary moves in a campaign of unprecedented scope and ambition. Malekith, the Accursed, had been planning his war for millennia, ever since his people's defeat during the ancient conflicts that had established Asgardian dominance over the 9 realms. The Dark Elves of Svartalfheim had once been among the most powerful and technologically advanced civilizations in the known universe, masters of sciences that blended physical manipulation with mystical force in ways that few other cultures had ever achieved. Their fall from cosmic prominence had been complete and devastating, reducing them from galactic powers to refugees hiding in the deepest shadows of their ruined realm. But Malekith had never accepted this diminishment as permanent. Instead, he had used the long centuries of exile to study the weaknesses in Asgard's cosmic empire, and to develop strategies that could exploit those vulnerabilities with surgical precision. The Dark Elf King understood something that many of Asgard's enemies had failed to grasp. The 9 realms were not separate worlds connected by mystical bridges, but components of a single vast mechanism, whose stability depended upon carefully maintained balances of power and influence. Disrupt those balances in the right way, at the right time, and the entire system could be made to collapse inward upon itself. His strategy was elegantly simple in concept, but devastatingly complex in execution. Rather than attempting to challenge Asgard's military might directly, Malekith would systematically corrupt and capture each of the other realms, turning Odin's own empire against itself, while building an alliance of the conquered that could eventually overwhelm even the Golden City's legendary defenses. The campaign began in Alfheim, where Malekith's forces struck with precision that spoke of detailed intelligence gathering and careful preparation. The Light Elves' commitment to harmony and consensus made them vulnerable to infiltration tactics that exploited their reluctance to take decisive action against threats that had not yet manifested overtly hostile intentions. Dark Elf infiltrators had spent decades establishing themselves within Alfheim's social structures, presenting themselves as refugees seeking asylum from Svartalfheim's harsh conditions. Their patient work bore fruit when they simultaneously activated sophisticated reality distortion devices that turned the Light Elves' own harmonious nature against them, creating feedback loops that amplified their peaceful impulses into complete paralysis. By the time Alfheim's leaders recognized what was happening, their realm had been effectively neutralized, not destroyed, but transformed into a staging ground for further operations. The Light Elves were not killed or enslaved, but rather placed into a form of mystical stasis that preserved their lives while preventing any resistance to Malekith's plans. Thor's discovery of Alfheim's fate came too late to prevent the initial conquest, but it provided crucial intelligence about the scope and sophistication of the threat facing all the realms. The attack had been executed with a level of strategic thinking that surpassed anything the Dark Elves had previously demonstrated, suggesting that Malekith had evolved far beyond the crude conqueror that Asgardian military doctrine had prepared to face. "This is not invasion," Thor reported to the Asgardian War Council, his voice heavy with the implications of what he had witnessed. "This is transformation, the systematic conversion of each realm into a component of some larger mechanism that we do not yet understand. Alfheim still exists, but it now serves Malekith's purposes rather than its own." Odin's response was swift and decisive, mobilizing Asgardian forces for what promised to be the most challenging military campaign since the original conquest of the Nine Realms. But the All-Father's strategy was hampered by incomplete intelligence about Malekith's true capabilities and objectives, forcing Asgard to react to events rather than shape them. The second phase of Malekith's campaign targeted Nidavellir, where the strategic objective was not conquest, but control over the cosmic forges that produce the most advanced weapons and artifacts in the known universe. The Dark Elves could not hope to match the dwarves' craftsmanship through conventional means, but they possessed something equally valuable: detailed knowledge of the mystical principles that governed the forging process. The attack on Nidavellir was a masterpiece of technological warfare that combined Dark Elf reality manipulation techniques with captured Light Elf harmonic technologies and weapon systems that had been developed in the deepest vaults of Svartalfheim. The result was a form of warfare that operated on multiple dimensional levels simultaneously, attacking not just the physical infrastructure of the Dwarven realm, but the conceptual foundations that allowed their technology to function. Eitri and his master smiths found themselves fighting a war where their most powerful weapons simply ceased to function, where the cosmic forces they had mastered for eons suddenly obeyed different rules, where the very principles of creation and destruction that they had spent millennia learning to control were turned against them by enemies who understood those principles from completely different perspectives. Thor's arrival in Nidavellir came during the height of the battle, as Dark Elf forces pressed their assault against the primary forge complexes, where the most crucial artifacts were produced. The scene that greeted him was unlike anything he had experienced. Warfare conducted across multiple dimensions simultaneously, with combatants phasing between different levels of reality as they sought tactical advantages that conventional military thinking could not provide. "They know our methods too well," Eitri gasped as he and Thor fought back-to-back against enemies whose very presence caused the cosmic fires to burn in alien colors. "Every technique we use, every principle we apply, they have found ways to corrupt or subvert. It is as if they possess perfect knowledge of our deepest secrets." The revelation that followed was both illuminating and deeply troubling. Malekith's forces included Dark Elves who had once studied in Nidavellir as legitimate apprentices, individuals who had gained access to dwarven secrets through centuries of patient infiltration and careful relationship building. The intelligence gathering that had preceded the actual invasion was so comprehensive that the attackers understood their target's capabilities better than the defenders understood their own vulnerabilities. Thor's intervention in the battle for Nidavellir required him to employ techniques that went beyond conventional combat, drawing upon his growing understanding of cosmic forces to counter reality manipulation effects that threatened to unmake the very foundations of the Dwarven realm. Working alongside Eitri and the other master smiths, he helped develop rapid countermeasures that could neutralize the most dangerous Dark Elf technologies, while preserving the cosmic forges that were essential to the defense of all the realms. But even as they achieved tactical victories against immediate threats, the strategic situation continued to deteriorate. Reports flooded in from across the Nine Realms, each one describing new Dark Elf operations that demonstrated the incredible scope and coordination of Malekith's campaign. Vanaheim was under assault by forces that seemed to emerge from the realm's own natural features, as if the very landscape had been turned against its inhabitants. Muspelheim was experiencing coordinated attacks by entities that wielded ice and shadow against the fire giant's traditional flame-based defenses. Even Jotunheim, despite its traditional hostility toward Asgard, was facing invasions that threatened to exterminate the frost giant civilization entirely. The pattern that emerged from these reports was clear and terrifying in its implications. Malekith was not simply conquering the Nine Realms. He was systematically destroying the cultural and technological foundations that made each realm unique, replacing them with standardized systems that served his larger strategic objectives. The true scope of his plan became apparent when Thor received an urgent summons from Midgard, where Dr. Jane Foster and her research team had detected massive dimensional anomalies centered on several major Earth cities. The War of the Realms was not limited to the traditional 9. Malekith intended to extend his campaign to every dimension that was connected to the cosmic tree of Yggdrasil, including the mortal realm that Thor had sworn to protect. The invasion of Earth began with the systematic targeting of the planet's most significant mystical and technological centers, as Dark Elf forces sought to eliminate the defensive capabilities that Earth's heroes had developed over the years. New York, London, Tokyo, and a dozen other major cities found themselves simultaneously under assault by enemies that emerged from dimensional rifts that had been carefully positioned to maximize strategic impact while minimizing the defenders' ability to coordinate their responses. But Malekith had underestimated the resilience and adaptability of Earth's superhero community. Unlike the more traditional civilizations of the Nine Realms, Earth's defenders had been forged through exposure to constant crisis and challenge, developing tactical flexibility and innovative problem-solving approaches that were difficult for even sophisticated enemies to predict or counter. Thor's reunion with the Avengers came in the midst of the battle for Manhattan, where Captain America was coordinating a desperate defense against Dark Elf forces that had seized control of several key buildings and were using them as staging areas for further operations. The sight of his mortal allies fighting with such courage and determination against cosmic-level threats filled Thor with a mixture of pride and desperate urgency. "We've been holding them off," Captain America reported, as they fought their way through streets that had been transformed into alien battlefields. "But their technology is unlike anything we've faced before. They're not just attacking our defenses, they're rewriting the rules that make our defenses possible." The observation was astute and strategically crucial. Malekith's forces were employing reality manipulation techniques that were specifically designed to neutralize the technological and mystical advantages that Earth's heroes typically relied upon. Iron Man's advanced systems were experiencing systematic failures that defied conventional diagnosis, while even Dr. Strange's mystical defenses were being undermined by alterations to the fundamental magical principles that govern dimensional interactions. Thor's response drew upon every lesson he had learned during his travels through the realms and his growing understanding of cosmic forces. Working with Earth's scientific and mystical communities, he helped develop countermeasures that could restore the stability necessary for conventional defensive systems to function, while also coordinating with off-world allies who could provide reinforcements and alternative technological approaches. The alliance that formed in response to Malekith's invasion was unprecedented in its scope and diversity. Asgardian warriors fought alongside human soldiers and scientists, while light elves, who had escaped Alfheim's conquest, provided crucial intelligence about Dark Elf capabilities and weaknesses. Dwarven master smiths worked frantically to produce weapons and defensive systems that could function despite reality distortion effects, while Earth's heroes applied their hard-won experience with impossible challenges to problems that defied conventional solutions. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the alliance was the way it forced different cultures and civilizations to truly understand each other for the first time. Thor found himself serving not just as a military leader but as a cultural translator, helping beings from vastly different backgrounds find common ground and develop trust despite their fundamental differences in approach and perspective. The turning point in the War of the Realms came when the Alliance discovered the true nature of Malekith's ultimate objective. The Dark Elf King was not simply seeking to conquer territory or accumulate power for its own sake. He was attempting to fundamentally restructure the cosmic order itself. replacing the current system of independent realms with a unified empire that would operate according to Dark Elf principles and serve Dark Elf interests exclusively. The weapon he had developed to achieve this goal was a reality restructuring device that could rewrite the basic laws governing interdimensional relationships, effectively making him the supreme authority over all connected realms. The device required massive amounts of mystical energy to operate, which explained his systematic conquest of each realm he needed to control their magical infrastructure in order to power his cosmic transformation engine. Thor's discovery of this plan came through intelligence provided by Loki, whose own complex motivations had led him to infiltrate Malekith's organization, while maintaining the appearance of serving his own ambitions. The information was delivered through channels so convoluted that even Thor was not entirely certain of his brother's true loyalties, but its accuracy was confirmed by subsequent events. "He means to unmake everything," Loki explained during a clandestine meeting that took place in a pocket dimension accessible only through techniques that both brothers had learned during their youth. "Every culture, every tradition, every way of life that does not serve his vision will be simply edited out of existence, not destroyed, erased, as if they had never been." The implications were staggering. If Malekith succeeded, the rich diversity of cultures and approaches to existence that characterized the 9 realms would be replaced by a single, homogeneous system that reflected only Dark Elf values and priorities. Billions of beings would not just lose their freedom, they would lose their very identity, becoming components in a vast machine designed to serve objectives they could never understand or accept. The final battle against Malekith's forces was fought simultaneously across multiple dimensions, as the Alliance sought to prevent the activation of his reality restructuring device, while also liberating the realms that had already fallen under his control. Thor found himself at the center of conflicts that spanned scales from individual combat to cosmic warfare, requiring him to coordinate strategies that involved everything from street-level tactics to interdimensional mysticism. The victory, when it came, was hard-won and costly. Malekith's device was destroyed, but not before its partial activation had caused permanent alterations to several realms that would require centuries to fully understand and address. The Dark Elf King himself escaped destruction, but his power base had been shattered and his grand plan permanently disrupted. Perhaps more importantly, the War of the Realms had forged connections between different civilizations that would endure long after the immediate crisis had passed. The alliance that had formed to face Malekith's threat evolved into ongoing relationships that would provide stability and mutual support for generations to come. Thor's role in these events established him as more than just Asgard's champion or Earth's protector. He had become a figure of cosmic significance, whose actions and decisions could influence the destiny of entire reality systems. But with that recognition came responsibilities that would test every aspect of his character and wisdom in the trials that lay ahead. The War of the Realms was over, but its consequences would shape the future of the cosmos for eons to come.